Welcome, seeker of hidden knowledge, to the forbidden depths of bending mastery, where ancient secrets whisper through the darkness, like wind through mountain caves. Tonight, we explore the techniques that masters dared not teach, the abilities so dangerous they were buried beneath layers of tradition and fear. These are the arts that shaped empires and toppled kingdoms, that saved lives and ended them with equal precision. So, settle into the comfort of shadows. Let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of distant tides, and drift with us through the most closely guarded mysteries of the Four Nations, where power and wisdom dance on the razor's edge between creation and destruction. The crimson moon hung heavy over the Fire Nation prison camp like a bloodshot eye, its pale light filtering through iron bars to illuminate the face of a woman whose suffering had birthed something terrible and new into the world. Hummer's weathered fingers traced patterns in the stagnant air of her cell, movements so subtle that even the most observant guard would have dismissed them as the restless gestures of madness brought on by years of captivity and abuse that had broken stronger spirits than hers. But madness and genius often wear the same mask, and what the Fire Nation soldiers mistook for the vacant motions of a shattered mind were actually the careful experiments of someone discovering truths about waterbending that no teacher had ever dared to explore. The human body, Hummer had realized during her longest nights of desperation, was more water than earth, more fluid than solid, and if a skilled waterbender could manipulate the moisture in plants and the humidity in air, then surely the liquid that flowed through veins and arteries was simply another form of water, waiting to be bent to her will. The first time she felt the blood respond to her beckoning, moving like sluggish mercury through the body of the guard who had struck her earlier that day, Hammar's gasp of wonder was immediately followed by a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with physical pain and everything to do with the recognition that she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The technique she had stumbled upon was not simply another water-bending form, but a fundamental violation of the boundary between self and other, a reaching into the most intimate spaces of another person's being to seize control of their very life force. Yet the power was intoxicating in ways that went beyond mere revenge or the promise of escape, offering a sense of absolute dominion that made her feel like something more than human for the first time since her capture had reduced her to a number in the Fire Nation's catalogue of conquered peoples. When she commanded the guard to unlock her cell, watching his face contort with the effort of resisting an authority that bypassed his conscious will entirely, Hammer understood that she had discovered not just a new bending technique, but a new way of existing in a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty and indifference. The escape that followed was accomplished with surgical precision, her newfound ability, allowing her to turn the prison's own guards into unwilling accomplices, who moved according to her desires while their minds screamed protests that their bodies could not voice or act upon. Each puppet-like movement they performed under her control carved deeper lines of moral corruption into her spirit, but the freedom that beckoned beyond the compound walls made such considerations seem like luxuries she could not afford to indulge during the most crucial moments of her liberation. The bloodbending that had begun as desperate experimentation evolved during her years of hiding in the Earth Kingdom into something approaching an art form, though it was an art dedicated to purposes that would have horrified the waterbending masters who had taught her the flowing, nurturing movements that she now perverted into instruments of domination and control. The technique required not just exceptional skill, but a fundamental shift in how she understood the relationship between bender and element, transforming water from partner into weapon, and other people from fellow beings into objects to be manipulated at will. The psychological toll of wielding such power was evident in every aspect of Hummer's later life, her isolation from normal human contact, reflecting not just the practical necessity of hiding her abilities, but the spiritual corruption that came from repeatedly violating the most basic principles of consent and autonomy that made civilization possible. The cottage she inhabited in the woods near Gaipan became a fortress of solitude where she could nurse grievances that had metastasized into hatred so pure it no longer required specific targets to sustain its burning intensity. The Fire Nation citizens she captured during subsequent full moons were not chosen for any crimes they had committed or positions they held within the military hierarchy that had destroyed her homeland, but simply because their national origin made them acceptable vessels for the rage that had replaced every gentler emotion in her heart. Their disappearances created mysteries that local authorities could not solve and folklore that warned travelers away from the woods where something ancient and hungry was said to prowl when the moon showed its fullest face. The blood-bending she practiced during these nocturnal hunts had evolved far beyond the crude manipulations she had discovered in her prison cell, developing into something that approached telepathic control over her victims' motor functions, while leaving their consciousness intact to experience every moment of their helplessness. The technique's refinement allowed her to orchestrate elaborate scenarios where her captives performed complex actions according to scripts that existed only in her imagination, their bodies becoming actors in dramas, designed to provide her with the illusion of agency in a world that had stripped away every other form of power she had once possessed. But the true horror of bloodbending lay not in its applications during moments of active control, but in its lingering effects on both practitioner and victim, creating psychological wounds that time could never fully heal, and spiritual damage that extended beyond individual trauma to encompass broader questions about the nature of free will and human dignity. Those who survived encounters with Hama carried with them the knowledge that their bodies could be turned against them, that the physical form they had always considered inviolably their own could become a prison operated by someone else's malevolent intentions. The technique's discovery by other waterbenders was inevitable once Hama's activities eventually came to light, though most who learned of bloodbending's existence recoiled from it with the same instinctive revulsion that healthy immune systems show toward virulent diseases. The few who chose to explore its possibilities did so in secret, understanding that public knowledge of such abilities would fundamentally alter how waterbenders were perceived by the other nations and possibly trigger the kind of systematic persecution that had already devastated the air nomads. Katara's horrified reaction to being forced to learn bloodbending reflected not just personal distaste for the technique's applications, but deeper understanding of how its existence threatened to undermine everything positive that waterbending represented in the world's elemental balance. The art that had been associated with healing, with the nurturing aspects of water's life-giving properties, was revealed to have a shadow side that could transform the most compassionate benders into instruments of absolute tyranny over anyone unfortunate enough to fall within range of their abilities. The outlawing of bloodbending following the 100-Year War represented more than legal prohibition of a dangerous technique. It was society's attempt to contain knowledge that challenged fundamental assumptions about human autonomy and the limits of bending power. Republic City's legislation against bloodbending acknowledged that some abilities were too dangerous to permit even among licensed practitioners, that certain forms of power corrupted so completely that their mere existence posed threats to the foundations of civilized society. Yet prohibition could not eliminate knowledge that had already taken root in minds that found the promise of absolute control too tempting to abandon. And bloodbending continued to evolve in the shadows, where its practitioners could experiment without legal oversight or moral constraints. The technique's development during this underground period produced innovations that would have been impossible under normal circumstances, refinements that pushed the boundaries of what waterbending could accomplish, while simultaneously demonstrating why such boundaries had existed in the first place. Yakone's emergence as Republic City's most feared crime lord represented bloodbending's full flowering as an instrument of organized criminal activity. His abilities, having evolved beyond Hama's full moon limitations, to encompass manipulation that could be performed at will under any lunar phase. The genetic gift or spiritual mutation that enabled such enhancement remained mysterious, suggesting that bloodbending's development was constrained not just by skill and training, but by fundamental physiological factors that determined who could transcend the technique's traditional boundaries. The criminal empire that Yakone constructed using his abilities was unlike anything law enforcement had previously encountered, built not on violence or intimidation in any conventional sense, but on the absolute certainty that resistance was futile when the resistor's own body could be turned against them at a moment's notice. His victims found themselves helpless to oppose his will even when they were surrounded by witnesses and potential allies, their bodies responding to commands that bypassed every level of conscious decision-making to operate directly on the nervous system itself. The psychological warfare that such abilities enabled was perhaps even more devastating than their immediate practical applications, creating atmospheres of hopelessness that extended far beyond those who had directly experienced bloodbending's effects. The knowledge that such power existed somewhere in the city transformed Republic City's social dynamics, making everyone aware that their physical autonomy depended on avoiding the attention of someone whose abilities made conventional defenses meaningless. The courtroom attack that marked Yakone's final desperate bid for freedom demonstrated bloodbending's potential for mass manipulation, his simultaneous control of dozens of individuals, showing how the technique could be scaled beyond personal confrontations to encompass crowd control and even primitive forms of mind control that approached telepathic domination. The sight of an entire judicial proceeding being manipulated by a single individual's will provided stark illustration of how bloodbending threatened not just individual liberty, but the institutional frameworks that made democratic governance possible. Aang's initial helplessness against Yakone's enhanced abilities revealed limitations in Avatar power that had never been tested under such circumstances. The cosmic forces that made him master of all four elements, proving inadequate against a technique that bypassed bending entirely to operate directly on the biological systems that enabled consciousness and voluntary movement. The experience of being controlled so completely was traumatic in ways that extended beyond immediate physical vulnerability to encompass existential questions about the nature of self and agency that would haunt the Avatar for the remainder of his life. The Avatar state that eventually enabled Aang's escape from bloodbending manipulation represented not just superior power but fundamentally different relationship to life force itself. The cosmic consciousness that flowed through him during such episodes, transcending individual biology to access energy patterns that Yakone's technique could not reach or redirect. The victory was as much philosophical as tactical, demonstrating that spiritual development could provide resources for resisting even the most intimate forms of physical control. The energy bending that Aang employed to permanently remove Yakone's abilities was both punishment and mercy, eliminating his capacity for future harm, while preserving his life and providing opportunity for reflection that execution would have foreclosed. The technique's application required absolute moral certainty and spiritual purity that few individuals could maintain under pressure, making it unsuitable as a general solution to the problems that bloodbending posed for society's continued development. Noatak's transformation into Amun represented bloodbending's evolution into something approaching religious crusade, his abilities having been refined through years of intensive training and psychological conditioning that enabled applications Yakone had never imagined possible. The Kai blocking techniques that he combined with bloodbending created hybrid methodology that could permanently disable other benders without requiring the avatar's energy bending intervention, suggesting possibilities for bloodbending development that extended far beyond simple physical manipulation. The equalist movement that Amon constructed around his abilities demonstrated how bloodbending could be used not just for personal gain, but for broad social transformation. His promise to remove bending from the world appealing to non-benders whose resentment had been building throughout Republic City's early years of industrial development. The religious fervor that surrounded his campaign reflected deeper human needs for meaning and purpose that conventional political movements had failed to address adequately. The psychological manipulation that enabled Amon to maintain his dual identity as both equalist leader and bloodbending master required compartmentalization of his consciousness that bordered on multiple personality disorder. The contradictions between his public condemnation of bending and private mastery of its most forbidden techniques, creating internal tensions that eventually contributed to his movement's destruction. The mask he wore served not just as physical disguise, but as symbol of the spiritual division that made his crusade ultimately unsustainable. Tarlok's political career demonstrated how bloodbending could be employed within legitimate governmental structures to achieve results that democratic processes alone could not provide. His manipulation of fellow council members and political opponents, representing corruption of Republic City's institutions, that was far more subtle and dangerous than Yakone's crude criminal activities. The technique's applications in political contexts showed how power could be exercised invisibly, creating outcomes that appeared to result from normal legislative processes while actually reflecting the private agenda of someone whose abilities made genuine democracy impossible. The family tragedy that connected Yakone, Amon, and Tarlok illustrated how bloodbending's corruption extended beyond individual practitioners to encompass entire lineages. The technique's psychological demands, creating cycles of abuse and manipulation that passed from generation to generation, like hereditary diseases. The brothers' final confrontation aboard the speedboat represented not just personal conflict, but the inevitable collision between irreconcilable approaches to power that their father's legacy had made unavoidable. The explosion that ended both their lives was simultaneously murder and suicide, each brother choosing death rather than continued existence, in a world where their abilities made normal human relationships impossible, and their family history guaranteed that peace could never be achieved through conventional means. Their deaths marked the end of bloodbending's most organized and dangerous period, though the knowledge they had developed could never be completely eliminated from the world's accumulated understanding of bending's darker possibilities. The spiritual implications of bloodbending extended beyond its immediate applications to encompass broader questions about the relationship between physical and metaphysical reality, the technique's effectiveness suggesting that consciousness itself might be more dependent on biological processes than spiritual traditions had previously acknowledged. The ease with which bloodbending could override free will challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and the sources of moral agency that formed the foundation of ethical thinking throughout the Four Nations. The healing arts that represented waterbending's positive potential served as constant reminder of how the same elemental mastery could be directed toward creation or destruction, preservation or violation, depending on the spiritual state and moral character of the practitioner. The duality inherent in water's nature was reflected in its bending forms, showing how techniques that could restore life and health could also be perverted into instruments of control and domination that threatened the very essence of what it meant to be human. The ban on bloodbending that remained in effect throughout the post-war period represented society's recognition that some knowledge was too dangerous to permit, even under carefully controlled circumstances, that certain abilities posed existential threats to civilization itself. that could only be managed through complete prohibition rather than regulation or supervised practice. The technique's continued existence in hidden corners of the world served as permanent reminder of how quickly progress could be reversed if humanity failed to maintain vigilance against its own darker impulses and the temptations that absolute power inevitably created. The morning mists that rose from the healing pools of the Northern Water Tribe carried with them the accumulated wisdom of generations who had understood that water was more than mere element, more than simple substance to be bent according to conscious will. These vapors held the memory of countless healings, the spiritual residue of techniques that had drawn their power, not from dominance over the physical world, but from harmonious cooperation with the life force that flowed through every living being like underground rivers, connecting all existence through channels too subtle for ordinary perception to detect. In the beginning, when the moon spirit still walked openly among mortals and the barrier between physical and spirit worlds was thin as morning frost, waterbending had been inseparable from healing, the two arts flowing together like tributaries joining to form a single mighty river whose current carried both destruction and renewal according to the wisdom and character of those who learned to navigate its depths. The earliest waterbenders understood that their element's true nature was change itself, the constant transformation that enabled life to adapt and grow and flourish, even under circumstances that seemed to promise only death and decay. The healing traditions that developed among the water tribes represented humanity's first systematic attempt to cooperate with natural forces rather than simply commanding them, recognizing that true mastery came not through imposing one's will upon the world, but through learning to work in harmony with processes that were far older and wiser than individual consciousness could ever hope to become. The techniques that emerged from this philosophical foundation treated the healer not as separate from the patient, but as part of a larger system where the restoration of balance in one area inevitably affected the equilibrium of the whole. Katara's journey from untrained village girl to master healer embodied the ancient truth that skill in the healing arts required not just technical proficiency, but spiritual development that went to the heart of what it meant to be human in a world where suffering was inevitable but not necessarily permanent. Her earliest attempts to use water for healing were clumsy and ineffective, hampered not by lack of bending ability, but by her incomplete understanding of how healing required the healer to surrender personal desires and ego-driven motivations in favor of serving needs that were larger than individual will. The Northern Water Tribe's healing traditions, preserved through generations of careful instruction and reverent practice, provided Katara with systematic knowledge that her grandmother Kanna had been unable to transmit due to the disruptions caused by Fire Nation raids and the gradual erosion of traditional knowledge that accompanied the Southern Tribes' military struggles. The healing masters of the North had maintained not just technical expertise but the spiritual context that made such expertise meaningful, understanding that healing was ultimately a form of prayer, made manifest through skilled manipulation of the element that connected all life. Master Yugoda's instruction revealed to Katara that true healing required the practitioner to enter into empathetic union with the patient's suffering, feeling their pain as if it were one's own, while maintaining sufficient emotional distance to avoid being overwhelmed by sensations that could incapacitate someone whose role was to provide help rather than simply sharing in the experience of distress. This delicate balance between involvement and detachment was perhaps the most difficult aspect of healing to master, requiring psychological maturity that many otherwise skilled waterbenders never achieved. The technique itself involved using water as a medium through which the healer's spiritual energy could flow into areas where the patient's natural life force had become blocked or misdirected by injury, illness, or emotional trauma that manifested as physical symptoms. The water served not just as conductor but as purifier, carrying away toxins and negative energy, while simultaneously delivering healing intention that worked to restore the natural patterns of energy flow that characterized healthy functioning in both body and spirit. The quality of water used for healing could dramatically affect the technique's effectiveness, with the most powerful healers learning to recognize subtle differences in spiritual potency that were invisible to ordinary perception, but crucial for addressing serious injuries or chronic conditions that had resisted other forms of treatment. Water from sacred springs, glacial melt that had never touched polluted ground, or liquid that had been blessed through prolonged exposure to spiritual practices, carried enhanced healing properties that could accomplish miracles when wielded by practitioners who understood how to channel such gifts appropriately. The spirit water from the Spirit Oasis in the Northern Water Tribe represented the ultimate refinement of healing liquid, its properties enhanced by centuries of close contact with Tui and La, the moon and ocean spirits, whose cosmic dance maintained the balance that made all life possible. This water contained not just enhanced healing properties, but direct connection to the spiritual forces that governed life and death, enabling healers who used it to accomplish restorations that bordered on resurrection when applied under proper circumstances with sufficient skill and spiritual authority. Katara's use of spirit water to revive Aang after Azula's lightning had brought him to the very threshold of death demonstrated how healing could transcend normal biological limitations when the healer possessed not just technical expertise, but absolute commitment to preserving life, regardless of personal cost or risk. The technique required her to channel her own life force through the spirit water into Aang's damaged body, temporarily merging their energy patterns in ways that could have killed them both if her concentration had wavered or her spiritual foundation had proven inadequate to support such intimate connection. The revival that followed was more than simple medical intervention. It was a form of spiritual resurrection that restored not just Aang's physical body, but his connection to the avatar state that Azula's attack had severed, demonstrating how the deepest forms of healing addressed not just immediate symptoms, but underlying spiritual damage that conventional medicine could never reach. The success of this intervention established Katara as one of the most powerful healers in recorded history, while illustrating the profound connections between love, sacrifice, and the kind of healing that transcended ordinary understanding of what was possible. The limitations that even the most skilled healers faced served as reminders that not all forms of damage could be reversed through external intervention, that some wounds required the patient's own spiritual work to heal completely, and that the healer's role was often to facilitate natural processes rather than imposing artificial solutions that might address symptoms while leaving deeper problems untouched. Scars, birth defects, and certain forms of internal damage fell beyond healing's reach, not because the techniques were inadequate, but because such conditions served purposes in the cosmic order that healing might disrupt in ways that caused greater harm than benefit. Mental distress represented a particularly challenging area for water-based healing. The connection between psychological and physical health, requiring healers to develop sensitivity to spiritual dimensions of their patients' conditions that were often invisible to conventional examination, but crucial for understanding the true sources of suffering. Katara's success in helping Jet recover his memories after the Dai Li's brainwashing demonstrated how healing could be applied to cognitive damage when the practitioner understood that memory was not simply stored in the brain, but distributed throughout the body's energy system in patterns that skilled manipulation could help restore. The healing techniques that had been developed in the Northern Water Tribe represented accumulated wisdom from countless generations of practitioners who had refined their understanding through careful observation of what worked and what failed, creating systematic approaches to common problems, while maintaining flexibility to address unique situations that required creative applications of fundamental principles. The apprenticeship system that transmitted this knowledge ensured that each new generation of healers received not just technical training, but the spiritual guidance necessary to use their abilities responsibly and effectively. Avatar Yang Chen's contributions to healing arts during her lifetime had expanded the traditional techniques in directions that reflected her unique perspective as someone who bridged the gap between human and cosmic consciousness. Her innovations combining conventional waterbending principles with insights drawn from her connections to the spirit world and her deep understanding of how individual suffering fit into larger patterns of cosmic balance. Her healing methods addressed not just immediate symptoms, but the karmic roots of illness and injury, helping patients understand how their current conditions might be connected to past actions or spiritual imbalances that required attention. The comprehensive medical treatises that Yang Chen compiled during her years as a fully realized avatar represented the most advanced healing knowledge that had ever been assembled in written form, combining practical techniques with philosophical insights that elevated healing from mere technique to spiritual practice that could transform both healer and patient through the process of working together to restore harmony between all aspects of their being. These texts became foundational documents for healing traditions throughout the water tribes and influenced medical practices in other nations as well. But perhaps the most legendary healer in Avatar history was Atuat, whose mastery extended beyond conventional technique to encompass abilities that seemed to violate natural laws regarding the relationship between life and death. Her interventions capable of retrieving people from the very brink of extinction, when others would have declared their cases hopeless beyond any possibility of recovery. Her reputation spread throughout the Northern Water Tribe and beyond, drawing desperate families from across the world to seek her assistance with conditions that had defeated every other healer they had consulted. Atuat's most remarkable innovation involved the deliberate manipulation of body temperature to slow metabolic processes to the point where death itself could be postponed indefinitely, buying time for natural healing to occur or for other interventions to be arranged while the patient remained suspended between life and death in a state that was neither fully alive nor completely gone. The technique required extraordinary precision and constant monitoring, any error in temperature control potentially causing brain damage or complete system failure that would make recovery impossible, even if the original condition could be addressed. The spiritual preparation that such extreme healing required was as demanding as the technical expertise, the healer needing to maintain perfect emotional equilibrium while working with patients whose conditions would naturally evoke powerful feelings of urgency, fear, and desperate hope that could interfere with the calm concentration that delicate temperature manipulation demanded. Atuat's success with these techniques reflected not just her skill but her profound spiritual development, her ability to work at the intersection of life and death without being overwhelmed by the cosmic forces she was channeling through her healing practice. The teaching relationship that developed between Atuat and Avatar Kyoshi provided the Earth Kingdom's most formidable avatar with healing knowledge that would serve her throughout her extraordinarily long life, though Kyoshi's temperament and philosophy led her to explore applications that Atuat herself would never have considered appropriate or necessary. The temperature manipulation techniques that Atuat taught for healing purposes were transformed by Kyoshi into methods of execution that were both more precise and more merciful than conventional approaches to eliminating threats to innocent life. The moral complexity that arose from using healing knowledge for killing reflected deeper questions about the relationship between preservation and destruction that ran through all forms of advanced bending, the same techniques that could save lives being equally capable of ending them when applied with different intentions or under different circumstances. Kiyoshi's willingness to explore such applications represented her pragmatic approach to avatar responsibilities, her understanding that sometimes the greater good required actions that violated conventional moral constraints but served the broader purposes of maintaining justice and protecting the innocent from those who would exploit societies. Gentleness for destructio ins, the technique that became known as heart freezing, emerged from Kiyoshi's systematic exploration of how healing methods could be reversed or perverted to serve lethal purposes when circumstances required swift and certain elimination of threats that could not be addressed through conventional means. The precision required to freeze specific internal organs without affecting surrounding tissue was extraordinary, demanding not just perfect control over temperature manipulation, but intimate knowledge of human anatomy and physiology that took years of study to develop. The spiritual implications of using healing knowledge for killing created internal conflicts that even Kiyoshi's formidable will struggle to resolve completely. Her journals from this period, revealing the psychological toll that such applications took on someone who had originally learned these techniques to preserve life rather than destroy it. The compartmentalization required to maintain both healing and killing applications of the same fundamental abilities represented a form of spiritual division that influenced her approach to justice throughout her remaining centuries of Tang life. The discovery and development of spirit bending represented waterbending's evolution into realms that transcended the purely physical to encompass direct manipulation of the energy patterns that determined whether spiritual entities remained in harmony with cosmic order or fell into corruption and destructive behavior. The technique had been developed during Avatar Roku's era by a waterbender named Makituk, whose deep spiritual practices had enabled him to perceive the energy patterns that governed spirit behavior and develop methods for influencing them through applications of healing principles that treated spirits as patients requiring restoration of their natural balance. Makituk's initial experiments with spirit bending had been motivated by his encounters with corrupted spirits, whose negative energy was poisoning the natural environment around his village, creating dead zones where plants would not grow, and animals sickened and died for no apparent reason. His healing background enabled him to recognize that these spirits were suffering from a form of spiritual illness that disrupted their natural energy patterns in ways that were analogous to physical diseases that healers routinely treated in human patients. The technique that emerged from his research involved surrounding the corrupted spirit with specially treated water that had been infused with positive spiritual energy through prolonged meditation and prayer, the liquid serving as both a medium for transmitting healing intention and a purifying agent that could gradually restore the spirit's natural energy patterns to their healthy state. The process was time-consuming and demanding, requiring the practitioner to maintain perfect spiritual equilibrium while working with entities whose corruption made them dangerous and unpredictable. The successful application of spirit bending was marked by the spirit's transformation from its corrupted dark form to a glowing golden manifestation that indicated the restoration of its natural harmony with cosmic order, at which point it would either dissipate peacefully back to the spirit world or resume its normal function as a guardian or guide for the natural processes it had been created to oversee. The sight of such transformations was described by witnesses as profoundly moving, demonstrating the power of compassionate intervention to restore harmony even in cases where corruption seemed complete and irreversible. But spirit bending, like all powerful techniques, possessed a dark side. that could be exploited by practitioners whose motivations were selfish rather than altruistic. The same methods that could purify corrupted spirits being equally effective at corrupting pure ones through deliberate introduction of negative energy that disrupted their natural patterns and turned them into sources of destructive influence. This twisted application of spirit bending represented one of the most dangerous techniques in the Avatar universe, its potential for causing widespread spiritual damage, making it far more threatening than physical attacks that could only affect individual targets. The corruption of human spirits through dark spirit bending was theoretically possible, according to the technique's underlying principles, though the spiritual defenses that most humans possessed made such applications far more difficult than working with spirits who lacked the complex psychological structures that characterized human consciousness. The few recorded attempts to use spirit bending against human targets had produced results that were horrific and unpredictable, the victims suffering forms of spiritual damage that were impossible to heal through conventional means and often led to complete psychological breakdown or death. Avatar Korra's mastery of spirit bending during her confrontation with the dark spirits that Vaatu's influence had corrupted throughout Republic City demonstrated the technique's potential for large-scale spiritual intervention, her applications combining traditional methods with innovations that reflected her unique relationship with the spirit world and her enhanced avatar abilities. Her success in purifying multiple spirits simultaneously showed how the technique could be scaled up to address crisis situations that threatened the balance between physical and spirit worlds. The energy requirements for such extensive spirit bending were enormous, demanding not just technical skill, but spiritual resources that could only be maintained by someone whose connection to cosmic forces was powerful enough to channel the kind of positive energy that mass purification required. Korra's ability to sustain such efforts reflected both her natural abilities and her intensive spiritual training, though the experience left her temporarily weakened and required extended recovery periods to restore her energy reserves to normal levels. Unalaq's corrupted version of spirit bending represented the technique's ultimate perversion. His systematic corruption of spirits throughout the Southern Water Tribe, demonstrating how someone with sufficient skill and malicious intent could use healing methods to spread spiritual poison on a scale that threatened the fundamental balance between physical and spirit worlds. His applications combined spirit bending with dark spiritual practices that amplified his natural abilities, while gradually corrupting his own spirit in ways that made him increasingly dangerous and unpredictable. The connection between spirit bending and conventional healing became clear during Korra's later adventures. Her use of spirit-enhanced healing techniques, showing how the same principles that govern spirit purification could be applied to human patients whose conditions had spiritual as well as physical components. The integration of these approaches represented a significant advance in healing arts, creating treatment methods that addressed the whole person rather than simply alleviating symptoms while leaving underlying spiritual imbalances untouched. The teaching of spirit bending to qualified practitioners required not just technical instruction but intensive spiritual preparation that ensured students possessed the moral foundation necessary to resist the corrupting influences they would encounter while working with dark spirits or applying the technique's more dangerous applications. The screening process for potential students was rigorous, eliminating anyone whose motivations were questionable or whose spiritual development was insufficient to handle the responsibilities that such knowledge entailed. The preservation of spirit-bending knowledge for future generations required careful balance between making the technique available to those who needed it and preventing its misuse by individuals who lacked the wisdom or character necessary to apply it responsibly. The oral traditions that transmitted such knowledge included not just technical instructions but cautionary tales about practitioners who had fallen to corruption and the devastating consequences that had resulted from their failures to maintain spiritual discipline while working with forces that could transform healers into sources of the very suffering they had originally sought to alleviate. The water that connected all these healing arts, from conventional medical techniques to the most advanced forms of spirit bending, remained the element of change and adaptation, its flowing nature reflecting the constant transformation that characterized life itself and the eternal possibility for healing and renewal that existed even in the darkest circumstances. The practitioners who mastered these techniques understood that they were servants of this greater process, their individual skills and knowledge merely instruments through which the elemental force could express its fundamental nature as the source of life and the medium through which all beings could find their way back to harmony and health when suffering threatened to overwhelm their capacity for joy and growth. The mountain paths that led to Avatar Kyoshi's secluded training grounds were carved from stone that had witnessed more death than birth, more endings than beginnings, the very rocks seeming to exhale the accumulated weight of decisions that had shaped the Earth Kingdom's most uncompromising avatar into someone whose approach to justice made even hardened warriors whisper prayers of gratitude that her legendary wrath had never been turned in their direction. These were the places where Kyoshi had learned to transform healing into execution, where the gentle art of preserving life had been perverted into techniques so precise and terrible that their very existence challenged every assumption about the relationship between mercy and justice. The woman who would become history's most feared avatar had not begun her journey with any intention of developing methods that could kill with the same precision that others used to heal. Her initial exposure to advanced healing techniques, reflecting nothing more sinister than the practical recognition that someone in her position would inevitably encounter injuries that conventional medicine could not address adequately. The burden of avatar responsibility, with its constant exposure to violence and conflict, made medical knowledge a necessary survival skill rather than a scholarly pursuit, healing abilities as essential to her arsenal as earthbending mastery or political cunning. Atuat's reputation as the Northern Water Tribe's most skilled healer had drawn Kyoshi across thousands of miles of treacherous terrain during a particularly brutal winter. Her determination to learn advanced healing techniques, reflecting not academic curiosity, but desperate need born from watching too many friends and allies die from injuries that better medical knowledge might have prevented. The journey itself had been a form of pilgrimage, each step through frozen wilderness, serving as meditation on the nature of life and death, and the responsibilities that came with possessing power over both. The healing master who greeted Kyoshi at the Northern Water Tribe's medical facilities was unlike any teacher she had previously encountered. Atuat's serene demeanor masking depths of knowledge and experience that had been accumulated through decades of working at the boundary between life and death, where the smallest errors could transform healing sessions into funeral preparations. Her eyes held the calm certainty of someone who had faced the ultimate questions about existence and meaning, and found answers that enabled her to work with dying patients without being consumed by the fear and despair that such encounters naturally evoked. The instruction that followed was unlike any educational experience in Kyoshi's lengthy academic career, Atuat's teaching methods requiring not just intellectual understanding, but spiritual development that went to the core of what it meant to take responsibility for another being's continued existence in physical form. The techniques themselves were secondary to the philosophical framework that made their application possible, healing being revealed as fundamentally an act of love rather than technical manipulation, requiring the practitioner to approach each patient with absolute commitment to their welfare regardless of personal cost or inconvenience. The temperature manipulation techniques that form the cornerstone of Atuat's most advanced healing methods required understanding of human physiology that went beyond conventional medical knowledge to encompass the subtle relationships between body temperature, metabolic rate, and the spiritual energy patterns that governed all biological processes. The practitioner had to learn to perceive the normally invisible connections between physical symptoms and underlying energy imbalances, recognizing how changes in one area would inevitably affect the equilibrium of the whole system. The technique of therapeutic hypothermia that Atuat taught involved gradually lowering a patient's core body temperature to the point where cellular metabolism slowed to a crawl, effectively stopping the progression of death itself, while natural healing processes or medical interventions could address whatever condition had brought the person to the brink of extinction. The precision required was extraordinary, the difference between life-saving intervention and fatal freezing being measured in fractions of degrees that demanded constant monitoring and adjustment throughout the treatment period. The spiritual preparation that such extreme healing required was as demanding as the technical expertise, the healer needing to maintain perfect emotional equilibrium while working with patients whose conditions would naturally evoke powerful feelings of urgency and desperation that could interfere with the calm concentration that delicate temperature control demanded. Atuat's success with these techniques reflected not just her skill but her profound spiritual development, her ability to work at the intersection of life and death without being overwhelmed by the cosmic forces she channeled through her practice. Kyoshi's natural aptitude for these advanced techniques surprised even Atuat, whose extensive experience had taught her to recognize the rare individuals who possessed both the intellectual capacity and spiritual fortitude necessary to master healing methods that most practitioners would never attempt. The Earth Kingdom, Avatar's earthbending background, provided unexpected advantages in temperature manipulation, her connection to solid matter, enabling her to perceive thermal patterns with unusual clarity, while her experience with precise control gave her the fine motor skills that the technique demanded. The months of intensive training that followed transformed Kyoshi's understanding of healing from simple medical technique to profound spiritual practice that connected her directly to the life force that animated all existence. Her growing mastery, enabling her to work with cases that other healers would have declared hopeless, while developing the kind of sensitivity to biological processes that made her aware of every subtle change in her patients' conditions. The education was simultaneously empowering and humbling, demonstrating both the remarkable things that skilled intervention could accomplish and the ultimate limitations that even the most advanced techniques could not transcend. But the philosophical discussions that accompanied the technical instruction revealed depths in Kyoshi's thinking that Atuat found increasingly troubling. The Avatar's questions about the relationship between healing and harming, suggesting intellectual directions that went beyond academic curiosity to encompass practical considerations about how the same knowledge could be applied for opposite purposes. The moral framework that guided Atuat's practice was built on absolute commitment to preserving life, while Kyoshi's Avatar responsibilities sometimes required her to make decisions about ending lives that posed threats to innocent people. The tension between these worldviews became increasingly apparent as Kyoshi's training progressed, her natural inclination toward decisive action conflicting with healing traditions that emphasized patience and gradual intervention rather than the kind of swift solutions that political and military crises often demanded. The Avatar's questions about reversing healing techniques or applying them in ways that their creators had never intended reflected thinking patterns that made Atuat increasingly uncomfortable, despite her recognition that Kyoshi's responsibilities were unlike those of any other healer in History. The breakthrough that led to heart freezing occurred during Kyoshi's final weeks of training. Her experimentation with temperature manipulation, having reached the point where she could lower a patient's core temperature with surgical precision while maintaining their consciousness and ability to communicate throughout the process. The technique required her to navigate the narrow zone between therapeutic hypothermia and fatal freezing, developing sensitivity to biological feedback that enabled her to stop the cooling process at exactly the right moment to achieve medical benefit without causing permanent damage. But Kyoshi's systematic mind had already begun exploring what would happen if the cooling process were allowed to continue beyond therapeutic levels. Her theoretical understanding of the technique revealing how gradual temperature reduction could be used to cause death that would appear natural to any observer who lacked knowledge of advanced healing methods. The precision that made therapeutic hypothermia possible could be redirected toward ensuring that vital organs shut down in sequence, creating a form of execution that was both certain and merciful compared to conventional methods of judicial killing. The ethical implications of developing lethal applications for healing techniques created internal conflicts that Kyoshi struggled to resolve throughout her remaining time with Atuat. Her growing understanding of the technique's deadly potential, competing with the healing philosophy that had made such knowledge possible in the first place. The compartmentalization required to maintain both healing and killing applications of the same fundamental abilities represented a form of spiritual division that would influence her approach to justice throughout her extraordinarily long life as Avatar. Atuat's discovery of Kyoshi's theoretical explorations led to confrontations that tested both women's commitment to their respective philosophies. The healing master's horror at seeing her life-saving techniques perverted into methods of execution, conflicting with Kyoshi's pragmatic recognition that Avatar responsibilities sometimes required actions that violated conventional moral constraints. The debates that followed revealed fundamental differences in their understanding of the relationship between individual conscience and cosmic responsibility. Healing traditions emphasizing personal virtue, while Avatar duties demanded consideration of consequences that extended far beyond individual moral purity. The departure from the Northern Water Tribe that ended Kyoshi's formal healing education was marked by mutual respect, tinged with sadness, both women recognizing that their philosophical differences made continued collaboration impossible, despite their personal affection and professional admiration for each other's abilities and character. Atuat's final words of warning about the spiritual dangers of using healing knowledge for killing proved prophetic, though Kyoshi's response suggested that she had already accepted whatever costs her chosen path would exact from her soul. The first application of heart freezing occurred months later during Kyoshi's confrontation with a warlord whose army had been systematically murdering civilians in villages throughout the Earth Kingdom's eastern provinces, his reign of terror having continued despite multiple attempts by local authorities to bring him to justice through conventional legal and military means. The Avatar's initial attempts to resolve the situation through negotiation and political pressure had failed completely, the warlord's response to diplomatic overtures being increased brutality toward innocent people who had no connection to the political disputes that motivated his campaign of destruction. The technique that ended the warlord's life was applied with surgical precision during what appeared to be a routine diplomatic meeting. Kyoshi's mastery of temperature manipulation, enabling her to gradually lower his core body temperature while maintaining normal conversation about territorial disputes and compensation for previous damages. The process was invisible to observers and apparently painless for the target, his death appearing to result from sudden cardiac failure rather than deliberate intervention by someone whose healing knowledge had been perverted into an instrument of execution. The spiritual cost of using healing techniques for killing became apparent in the days following this first application. Kyoshi's dreams filled with images of Atuat's disappointed face and memories of the healing philosophy she had abandoned in favor of decisive action that served political necessity rather than individual virtue. The compartmentalization required to maintain both healing and killing applications of temperature manipulation created internal tensions that manifested as physical symptoms, including insomnia, appetite loss, and persistent feelings of spiritual emptiness that no amount of meditation or self-justification could completely resolve. But the effectiveness of heart freezing as a method of eliminating threats that conventional justice could not address made it increasingly tempting to employ whenever Kyoshi encountered situations where other approaches had failed or seemed likely to result in prolonged suffering for innocent people. The technique's invisibility and apparent naturalness made it ideal for dealing with corrupt officials, criminal leaders, and political figures whose removal would benefit society, but whose deaths needed to appear accidental to avoid creating martyrs or destabilizing legitimate governmental institutions. The development of variations on the basic heart-freezing technique reflected Kyoshi's systematic exploration of how temperature manipulation could be applied to different organs and biological systems, her growing expertise enabling her to cause death through kidney failure, liver dysfunction, or brain damage depending on what kind of apparent cause would be most believable given the target's age, health, and lifestyle. The precision required for such selective organ failure was extraordinary, demanding intimate knowledge of human anatomy and physiology that took years of study and practice to develop. The psychological adaptation that enabled Kyoshi to use these techniques without being overwhelmed by guilt or moral conflict involved developing separate mental compartments for healing and killing applications, treating them as fundamentally different activities that happen to employ similar technical knowledge, rather than as variations on the same underlying practice. This division allowed her to continue using healing techniques to save lives, without being paralyzed by awareness of how the same knowledge could be used to end them, though the compartmentalization came at the cost of spiritual integration that might have been necessary for her complete psychological health. The secrecy that surrounded heart freezing was absolute. Kyoshi's understanding that knowledge of the technique's existence would fundamentally alter how people viewed healing practitioners, making it essential that her methods remain hidden from everyone, including her closest allies and advisors. The isolation that such secrecy created added another layer of psychological burden to the already considerable stress of maintaining dual applications for the same fundamental abilities. The inability to discuss the technique with anyone, making it impossible to process the moral complexities through normal social support systems. The teaching of heart freezing to trusted students was considered and rejected repeatedly throughout Kyoshi's long career. Her recognition that the technique's corrupting influence could not be adequately controlled through screening or moral instruction, making it too dangerous to pass on to future generations, even when circumstances seemed to justify expanding the number of people who possessed such capabilities. The decision to let the technique die with her represented both practical wisdom and spiritual sacrifice, accepting that beneficial applications would be lost in order to prevent inevitable misuse by practitioners who lacked her unique combination of power, responsibility, and moral foundation. The legacy of heart freezing extended beyond its immediate applications to encompass broader questions about the relationship between healing and harming that influenced how subsequent avatars approached the balance between preservation and destruction that their cosmic responsibilities demanded. The knowledge that healing techniques could be perverted into methods of execution served as permanent reminder of how easily good intentions could be corrupted by practical necessities, how the same knowledge that could save lives could also be used to end them when circumstances seem to justify such applications. The spiritual implications of heart freezing went to the core of waterbending philosophy, challenging the element's association with life and healing by demonstrating how water's fundamental nature as the medium of change could be directed toward death as easily as toward preservation when the practitioner possessed sufficient knowledge and questionable enough morality to explore such applications. The technique's existence served as warning about the dangers inherent in all advanced bending abilities, their potential for good always balanced by equal capacity for evil, depending on the character and motivations of those who wielded them. The moral questions raised by heart freezing remained unresolved throughout Kyoshi's lifetime and beyond, her journals revealing ongoing struggles with the ethical implications of using healing knowledge for killing, even when such applications served the greater good by eliminating threats that conventional justice could not address. The technique represented the ultimate expression of avatar pragmatism, the willingness to sacrifice personal virtue for cosmic responsibility, even when such choices created spiritual wounds that could never fully heal. The temperature that killed was the same temperature that healed, the difference lying not in the technique itself but in the intention and duration of its application, demonstrating how thin the line between creation and destruction could be when advanced practitioners explored the full potential of their elemental mastery. The precision that made therapeutic hypothermia possible also enabled controlled organ failure, showing how knowledge designed to preserve life could be redirected toward ending it when circumstances seemed to justify such extreme measures. The ice that formed in the hearts of Kyoshi's victims was more than frozen water. It was crystallized justice, her judgment made manifest through the element that connected all life, while simultaneously possessing the power to end it when preservation of individual existence conflicted with protection of innocent people who deserved to live without fear of predators whose actions threatened the foundations of civilized society. The technique that began as healing and ended as execution embodied the terrible responsibilities that came with avatar power, the necessity of sometimes choosing between competing goods when all available options required moral compromises that would haunt the decision-maker for the remainder of their extraordinarily long life. The underground chambers beneath Jiaoling where Toph Beifong first discovered the impossible had been carved by badger moles, whose patient work over millennia had created spaces that existed in perfect harmony with the Earth's natural rhythms, their tunnels following mineral veins and geological structures, rather than imposing arbitrary human geometries upon stone that had been shaped by forces far older than civilization itself. These were the sacred spaces where earthbending had been born through communion between creatures who understood stone as living substance rather than mere obstacle, where the first humans had learned to dance with rock and soil through observation of beings whose entire existence was devoted to moving through solid matter as easily as fish navigated water. The metal cage that held the young Beifong heiress prisoner would have been an impenetrable barrier to any conventional earthbender, its iron bars representing the triumph of Fire Nation industrial technology over elemental mastery that had traditionally been considered absolute within its chosen domain. The wrestling tournament that had led to her capture had been intended as harmless entertainment, the blind bandit's participation in Earth Rumble matches providing her with the only outlet for abilities that her wealthy parents considered too dangerous and undignified for someone of her social position to display in public forums, where common people might witness aristocratic power being used for mere sport. But the Earth Rumble arena had also provided Toph with educational opportunities that no formal instruction could have matched. Her opponent's diverse styles and creative applications, forcing her to develop innovations that went far beyond the traditional earthbending forms that her private tutors had taught with reverent adherence to ancient patterns. The underground fighting circuit attracted practitioners from every corner of the Earth Kingdom, their techniques shaped by regional variations and personal necessity rather than academic theory, creating an environment where practical effectiveness mattered more than adherence to established traditions. The desperation that drove Toph's breakthrough into metal bending was born not just from immediate physical captivity, but from recognition that her entire life had been a form of imprisonment. Her parents' well-intentioned protection, having created barriers between her and the world that were as confining as any cage. Despite being constructed from love and social convention, rather than iron and steel, the discovery that metal contained traces of earth that could be manipulated by someone with sufficient sensitivity and determination represented more than technical innovation. It was a fundamental challenge to the limitations that others had imposed upon her capabilities and potential. The first tremor that passed through the metal bars was so subtle that even Toph initially doubted what her enhanced senses were reporting, the vibrations seeming impossible given everything she had been taught about the absolute boundaries that separated different materials and the elements that could influence them. But her connection to Earth through seismic sense had always revealed details that normal vision could never perceive. Her blindness, having forced her to develop sensitivity to mineral composition and geological structure that enabled her to recognize the earthen impurities embedded within seemingly pure metal. The technique that emerged from this recognition required her to abandon every assumption about earthbending that her formal education had instilled, approaching metal not as foreign substance, but as earth that had been transformed by fire and human industry, while retaining its essential elemental nature beneath layers of refinement and processing. The bending that followed was unlike anything in her previous experience, requiring her to reach through the metal's surface properties to connect with the trace elements that provided purchase for her earthbending abilities, to manipulate matter that appeared to belong to a completely different category of chord, existence. The explosion of metal fragments that accompanied her escape was as much emotional release as technical achievement. Years of suppressed frustration and constrained potential, finding expression through demonstration of power that transcended every limitation that had been placed upon her abilities by people who confused protection with imprisonment. The sound of twisted iron and broken locks echoed through the underground chambers like thunder, announcing the birth of a new form of bending that would fundamentally alter how earthbenders understood their relationship with the material world. The immediate implications of metal bending's discovery were staggering in their scope, the technique's existence suggesting that the traditional boundaries between elements were far more permeable than anyone had previously imagined, while raising questions about what other supposedly impossible manipulations might be, achievable by practitioners willing to challenge established assumptions about their art's limitations. The revelation that metal could be bent meant that every fortress, every weapon, every tool of industrial civilization suddenly became potential extension of earthbender will, transforming the balance of power between nations in ways that would take decades to fully understand. But Toph's initial applications of metal bending were crude and limited, her breakthrough having provided access to new possibilities without immediately conferring the refined control that traditional earthbending had taken years of practice to develop. The technique required her to maintain contact with metal surfaces or remain close enough to perceive their internal structure through seismic vibrations, proximity limitations that made it unsuitable for the kind of long-range applications that would eventually revolutionize both construction and law enforcement throughout the post-war world. The months of experimentation that followed her escape were conducted in secret, Toph's understanding that metal bending knowledge would be invaluable to both military strategists and criminal organizations, making it essential that she master the technique completely before revealing its existence to anyone who might exploit such abilities for purposes that conflicted with her personal moral framework. The training she conducted alone in hidden caves and abandoned mines pushed her earthbending skills to their absolute limits, while forcing her to develop entirely new ways of perceiving and manipulating matter. The theoretical framework that eventually enabled reliable metal bending emerged from Toph's systematic analysis of how different types of metal responded to her attempts at manipulation. Her experiments revealing that iron-based alloys were most susceptible to earthbending influence, while highly refined materials like platinum contained so few earthen impurities that they remained effectively immune to her abilities. The discovery that purification processes could render materials unbendable provided both insight into the technique's mechanisms and warning about its potential limitations in confronting advanced technology. The founding of the Beifong Metal Bending Academy represented Toph's commitment to sharing her revolutionary discovery with students who possessed both the technical ability and moral character necessary to use such powerful techniques responsibly. Though the screening process for potential pupils was rigorous enough to eliminate anyone whose motivations seemed questionable, or whose earthbending foundation was insufficient to support the additional complexities that metal bending training demanded. The curriculum that emerged from her teaching experience balanced technical instruction with philosophical guidance about the responsibilities that came with abilities that could so dramatically alter existing power structures. The Academy's early graduates formed the core of Republic City's metal bending police force, their unique abilities making them ideally suited for law enforcement in an urban environment where conventional earthbending was often impractical due to the prevalence of metal construction and the need to avoid damaging infrastructure while pursuing criminal suspects through complex architectural space. The techniques they developed for restraining lawbreakers using metal cables and armor showed how metal bending could be applied defensively to minimize violence while ensuring that dangerous individuals could be apprehended safely. The evolution of metal bending from Toph's initial crude manipulations to the refined techniques employed by her advanced students demonstrated how innovative bending forms could develop rapidly when practitioners were willing to experiment systematically rather than simply repeating traditional patterns that had been established under different circumstances. The cable-based mobility systems that enabled police officers to navigate vertical urban environments with unprecedented speed and precision represented applications that would have been unimaginable during the technique's earliest developmental phase. But metal bending's greatest contribution to earthbending knowledge may have been the way it expanded understanding of seismic sense, the prerequisite skill that made metal manipulation possible while simultaneously revealing new dimensions of environmental awareness that had applications far beyond detecting earthen impurities in processed materials. The enhanced sensitivity that metal bending required enabled practitioners to perceive structural details of their surroundings with unprecedented precision, creating three-dimensional mental maps that included information about material composition, stress patterns, and potential points of failure or manipulation. Seismic sense itself had ancient origins that predated human earthbending by geological ages, the technique having been developed by badger moles, whose survival in underground environments required them to navigate through complete darkness using only vibrations transmitted through solid matter to create accurate mental representations of their surroundings. The precision of their environmental mapping was so extraordinary that they could detect the heartbeats of creatures dozens of feet away while simultaneously monitoring tunnel stability and identifying potential food sources through subtle, differences in the vibrational patterns that different materials and biological processes produced. The human discovery of seismic sense had occurred through careful observation of badger mole behavior, combined with systematic experimentation by earthbenders whose traditional site-based training had proven inadequate for mastering their element's full potential. The technique required practitioners to develop sensitivity to ground-transmitted vibrations while learning to interpret the complex patterns of information that such perception provided about environmental conditions, structural integrity, and the presence or absence of living beings in areas that visual observation could not reveal. Jian Yu's mastery of seismic sense during Avatar Kuruk's era had established the technique as one of earthbending's most valuable applications, his abilities enabling him to serve as both military strategist and geological surveyor for Earth Kingdom forces that needed to understand terrain features and enemy positions with accuracy that conventional reconnaissance could never achieve. His innovations in applying seismic awareness to combat situations provided tactical advantages that influenced the outcome of numerous conflicts, while demonstrating how enhanced perception could be as valuable as raw elemental power in determining battlefield success. The tragic story of Yun represented seismic sense's potential for corruption when combined with other advanced earthbending techniques and psychological instability that transformed natural gifts into instruments of destruction rather than tools for protection and service. His precision in manipulating Earth was so extraordinary that he could reshape human bodies by bending the trace minerals in their bones and tissues, a horrific application of earthbending principles that violated every moral constraint that traditionally governed the art's practice, while demonstrating capabilities that most practitioners would have considered theoretically impossible. Yun's fall from Avatar candidate to Earth Kingdom's most dangerous criminal illustrated how advanced bending abilities could become sources of spiritual corruption when their development outpaced the moral foundation necessary to use them responsibly. His mastery of techniques that granted power over life and death, creating temptations that his character proved insufficient to resist. The devastation he caused before being finally stopped served as permanent warning about the importance of balancing technical training with spiritual development that could provide ethical frameworks for wielding abilities that transcended normal human limitations. The lava bending that had originally been considered an Avatar-exclusive technique represented the intersection between earthbending and firebending that seemed to violate fundamental principles about elemental boundaries and the principles, limitations that prevented ordinary benders from manipulating one substances that belonged to other domains. The molten rock that lava benders could create and control possessed characteristics of both solid earth and flowing fire, requiring practitioners to understand principles from multiple bending traditions, while developing entirely new approaches to manipulating matter that existed in intermediate states between recognized categories. Avatar Sato's legendary applications of lava bending during his service as Fire Nation bureaucrat had established the technique as one of the most versatile and destructive abilities in the Avatar's arsenal. His innovations in using molten earth for both construction and warfare, providing models that would influence architectural and military thinking for centuries after his death. The geothermal systems he designed for heating Fire Nation cities demonstrated how lava bending could serve civilian purposes, while his volcanic fortifications showed how the same abilities could create defensive structures that were virtually impregnable against conventional assault. Avatar Roku's more dramatic applications of lava bending during his confrontation with Fire Lord Sozin reflected the technique's potential for massive environmental manipulation, his ability to reshape entire volcanic systems, enabling him to create or prevent eruptions that could affect regional climate patterns, while serving as demonstrations of avatar power that were visible from hundreds of miles away. The precision required to manage such large-scale geological forces was extraordinary, demanding understanding of plate tectonics and magma dynamics that went far beyond conventional earthbending education to encompass knowledge that bordered on earth science. Avatar Kyoshi's use of lava bending to separate Kyoshi Island from the mainland represented perhaps the most ambitious single application of earthbending in recorded history. Her manipulation of geological forces, enabling her to create new geography, while demonstrating the Avatar's ability to alter the physical world on scales that approached cosmic intervention. The technique required her to work with natural fault lines and volcanic activity rather than imposing her will against geological processes, showing how the most effective applications of Avatar power involved cooperation with natural forces rather than simple dominance over them. The revelation that non-Avatar earthbenders could master lava bending came as a shock to bending theorists who had assumed that the technique's dual elemental nature made it impossible for anyone lacking the Avatar's unique connection to all four elements to develop such abilities, safely or effectively. Sun's breakthrough at the Beifong Metal Bending Academy demonstrated that lava bending was actually a specialized application of earthbending, rather than true elemental fusion. The technique involving manipulation of earth that had been heated rather than actual control over fire itself. Bolin's natural aptitude for lava bending surprised everyone who knew him. His generally cheerful and uncomplicated personality, seeming incompatible with mastery of techniques that were associated with the earth element's most destructive applications. His ability to generate and control molten rock with minimal formal training suggested that lava bending might be more accessible than previously believed, though the rarity of practitioners indicated that most earthbenders lacked either the technical skill or psychological framework necessary to work with matter in such extreme states of transformation. Gazen's applications of lava bending during his service with the Red Lotus demonstrated the technique's devastating potential when wielded by someone whose philosophical commitments required him to destroy existing power structures regardless of collateral damage to innocent people or cultural treasures. His systematic demolition of Ba Sing Se's inner wall and the Northern Air Temple showed how lava bending could be used to eliminate defensive structures that had resisted conventional siege techniques for centuries, while his precision in targeting specific architectural elements revealed mastery that went beyond raw destructive power to encompass tactical sophistication. The psychological requirements for lava bending remained poorly understood, though most practitioners seemed to possess personality traits that enabled them to work comfortably with forces of destruction and transformation rather than the preservation and stability that characterized most earthbending applications. The technique's association with volcanic activity and geological violence suggested that successful lava benders needed to maintain psychological equilibrium while channeling energies that were inherently chaotic and potentially catastrophic if not managed with extraordinary care and precision. Sandbending represented earthbending's adaptation to desert environments where conventional techniques were often impractical due to the absence of solid rock and the prevalence of loose, shifting material that required different approaches to manipulation and control. The Sandbender tribes of the Si-Wong Desert had developed techniques that were specifically suited to their harsh environment, their mastery enabling them to navigate trackless wastes, while creating temporary structures and transportation systems that took advantage of sand's unique properties as a building material. The cultural traditions that surrounded sandbending were as distinctive as the techniques themselves, the desert tribes having developed social structures and survival strategies that reflected their environment's demands while preserving knowledge and practices that connected them to earthbending's ancient roots. Their sand sailors and navigation methods represented innovations that would have been impossible without intimate understanding of how wind patterns and geological features influence sand movement across vast distances, while their ability to locate water and shelter in apparently barren landscapes demonstrated practical applications that went beyond mere bending technique to encompass comprehensive desert survival skills. The relative accessibility of sand bending compared to other earthbending specializations reflected sand's intermediate properties between solid and liquid states, the material's flowing nature making it responsive to manipulation techniques that combined earthbending's characteristic stability with approaches borrowed from water and airbending traditions. The spiraling movements that characterized advanced sandbending forms showed clear influence from other elemental styles, demonstrating how environmental adaptation could lead to technical innovations that transcended traditional bending categories. Glass bending remained perhaps the rarest and least understood of all earthbending specializations. Avatar Kyoshi's single recorded application having demonstrated the technique's theoretical possibility without providing sufficient information for other practitioners to replicate her achievement reliably or safely. The incident that led to her discovery involved glass shards that had been embedded in her neck during combat. Her ability to bend the fragments safely out of her body, without causing additional injury, requiring precision and sensitivity that exceeded normal earthbending applications by enormous margins. The theoretical basis for glass manipulation lay in understanding that glass was essentially sand that had been heated and cooled under controlled conditions, its molecular structure retaining enough similarity to natural silicate minerals to provide purchase for earthbending techniques, while its processing had altered its properties sufficiently to require entirely new approaches to manipulation and control. The technique's potential applications in both defensive and offensive contexts were intriguing, though the skill requirements appeared to be so demanding that few earthbenders would ever develop sufficient mastery to use glass bending reliably in practical situations. The rarity of glass bending practitioners raised questions about whether Kyoshi's success had been the result of unique circumstances rather than reproducible technique. Her avatar status and exceptional earthbending abilities, potentially enabling manipulations that would be impossible for ordinary benders, regardless of their training or determination. The lack of recorded attempts to develop glass bending systematically suggested that most earthbenders considered the technique either too difficult to master or too limited in its applications to justify the enormous investment of time and effort that such specialized training would require. The legacy of Earth's hidden masteries extended beyond their immediate technical applications to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of elemental boundaries and the possibilities that remained unexplored within each bending tradition. The discoveries that had begun with Toph's breakthrough into metal bending had revealed that the conventional understanding of what each element could accomplish was far more limited than the actual possibilities that existed for practitioners willing to challenge established assumptions and explore new approaches to manipulating matter and energy. The integration of these advanced techniques into earthbending education would require fundamental revisions to traditional teaching methods and philosophical frameworks, the new possibilities demanding approaches that balanced innovation with respect for the wisdom embedded in ancient practices while ensuring that students develop the moral foundation necessary to use enhanced abilities responsibly. The future of earthbending would depend on successfully managing the tension between preserving valuable traditions and embracing revolutionary discoveries that could transform both individual practitioners and society as a whole. The ancient temples that crown the highest peaks of the world stood as monuments to humanity's first attempts to transcend the bonds of earth and stone, their spiraling towers reaching toward heavens, that seemed impossibly distant from the valleys where ordinary mortals conducted their daily affairs, without ever imagining that consciousness itself could be liberated from the weight of Kos, physical existence. These were the places where airbending had evolved beyond mere elemental manipulation to encompass spiritual practices that challenged the most fundamental assumptions about what it meant to be human, where masters had discovered that the ultimate expression of their art lay not in commanding wind and storm, but in achieving such perfect harmony with the element that the distinction between self and air became meaningless. The legends that spoke of human flight without mechanical assistance were dismissed by most scholars as impossible fantasies, stories invented to glorify ancient masters whose actual achievements had been embellished beyond recognition through generations of retelling that confused metaphorical descriptions of spiritual transcendence with literal accounts of physical levitation. But the air nomads preserved within their oral traditions careful records of individuals who had indeed achieved weightless existence. Their mastery, representing the culmination of spiritual development that had begun with simple breathing exercises and evolved over decades of dedicated practice into something that approached unity with the cosmic forces that governed atmospheric motion throughout the world. Guru Lagima's ascension to flight 4,000 years before Avatar Aang's time had established the theoretical possibility while demonstrating the extraordinary spiritual requirements that such achievement demanded from practitioners whose dedication to transcendence had to be absolute and irreversible. The Guru's teachings emphasized that flight was not a bending technique in any conventional sense, but rather a state of being that could only be achieved through complete liberation from all earthly attachments, including relationships, position, desire, and even the basic survival instincts that bound consciousness to physical form through networks of care and concern that created weight in both literal and metaphorical senses. The philosophical foundation that made flight possible was built upon understanding that gravity itself was not an external force to be overcome through superior power, but rather an expression of attachment that could be dissolved through sufficient spiritual development, the practitioner's consciousness gradually releasing its grip on material existence until the body naturally began to respond to subtler influences than the planet's mass. The process required years of careful preparation, during which candidates systematically eliminated every form of emotional bondage that connected them to the world of ordinary human experience, creating psychological conditions where physical liberation became not just possible but inevitable. The meditation practices that prepared potential flight candidates involved progressive detachment exercises that began with renunciation of material possessions and gradually expanded to encompass abandonment of all personal relationships, professional obligations, and individual identity markers that created psychological anchors to specific places, people, or concepts about who they were and what their lives should accomplish. The training was necessarily solitary, social connections being among the primary obstacles that prevented consciousness from achieving the kind of radical freedom that weightlessness required as its spiritual foundation. The dietary restrictions that accompanied flight training went beyond the air nomad's traditional vegetarianism to encompass complete fasting periods that could last for weeks, the practitioner's relationship with physical sustenance being gradually transformed until eating became an occasional necessity rather than regular pleasure, their body learning to derive energy from spiritual sources that did not require material consumption or create dependencies that would interfere with the detachment that flight demanded. The ability to survive without food for extended periods was both preparation for and sign of the spiritual transformation that would eventually enable physical levitation. The breathing techniques that formed the core of advanced flight training involved progressive refinement of the relationship between consciousness and respiration until the practitioner could maintain awareness and physical function while breathing so slowly and subtly that observers would often believe they had stopped breathing entirely. The mastery of breath that this required created conscious control over autonomic processes that normally operated below the threshold of awareness, enabling practitioners to regulate their body's responses to environmental conditions while maintaining the kind of mental equilibrium that spiritual transcendence demanded. The loneliness that inevitably accompanied serious flight training was perhaps its most challenging aspect, the systematic abandonment of human connections, creating psychological isolation that tested every candidate's commitment to transcendence while providing the emotional conditions where attachment to physical existence could be gradually dissolved through direct experience of what life without relationships actually entailed. Most potential students abandoned their training during this phase, their recognition that flight required permanent separation from everyone and everything they had ever loved, proving too high a price to pay for abilities that seemed increasingly meaningless. Without companions to share or witness their achievement, Guru Lagima's successful achievement of flight was accompanied by complete withdrawal from normal human society, his transcendence making him incapable of maintaining the kind of ordinary relationships and concerns that characterized earthbound existence, while his newfound abilities enabled him to survive independently of social structures and support systems that others required for their continued welfare. The poems he composed during his years of aerial wandering reflected both the liberation and isolation that flight had brought to his consciousness, their verses celebrating freedom while acknowledging the profound loneliness that such complete detachment inevitably created. The death that eventually claimed Guru Lagima occurred not through violence or disease, but through his conscious decision to release even his attachment to continued existence, his final transcendence, involving the dissolution of individual identity into cosmic consciousness, that made physical survival both impossible and irrelevant to someone whose spiritual development had progressed beyond the point where personal continuity held any meaning or value. The body that was eventually found in a high mountain cave showed no signs of injury or illness, his passing having been as peaceful as his flight had been serene. The legend that Lagima's achievement created served both as inspiration and warning for subsequent generations of air nomads, whose spiritual ambitions might lead them towards similar transcendence. The story illustrating both the ultimate possibilities that their tradition offered and the complete sacrifice of ordinary human existence that such possibilities demanded from anyone serious about pursuing them. The rarity of flight practitioners reflected not just the technique's difficulty, but the psychological costs that made most people unwilling to pay the price that weightlessness required as its spiritual foundation. Zahir's discovery of flight 4,000 years later occurred under circumstances that perfectly illustrated both the technique's requirements and the tragic irony inherent in achieving transcendence through loss rather than through systematic spiritual development, his liberation from earthly attachment being triggered not by gradual detachment practice, but by the sudden death of Pili, whose relationship with him had been the last remaining connection that bound his consciousness to concerns beyond his revolutionary philosophy and political objectives. The grief that accompanied Pili's death was simultaneously devastating loss and spiritual liberation, Zahir's profound love for her having been the final attachment that prevented his consciousness from achieving the kind of radical freedom that flight required. Her elimination by Lin Beifong's attack creating emotional conditions where his years of air nomad study could finally produce their ultimate expression in the form of weightless existence that no prison could contain and no conventional force could restrict or control. The flight that emerged from this tragic catalyst was both beautiful and terrible, demonstrating airbending's highest achievement while serving the destructive purposes that had motivated Zahir's original involvement with the Red Lotus organization and his systematic campaign to eliminate political leaders, whose authority he considered illegitimate obstacles to the natural chaos that he believed would create better conditions for human flourishing and spiritual development throughout the world. The philosophical corruption that characterized Zahir's approach to Air Nomad teachings was evident in his willingness to use flight for assassination and terrorism rather than the peaceful contemplation and spiritual service that had characterized Guru Lagima's applications of the same ability. His political ideology, having perverted traditional airbending principles into justifications for violence that violated everything the original masters had taught about compassion and respect for all forms of life. The combat applications that Zahir developed for flight were unprecedented in their lethality and tactical effectiveness. His ability to move through three-dimensional space without regard for conventional obstacles, enabling him to attack from angles that earthbound opponents could not anticipate or counter, while maintaining mobility that made him nearly impossible to pin down or restrict through normal defensive measures. The suffocation technique that Zahir employed against his victims represented airbending's darkest potential. His ability to remove air from around or within a target's body, creating death that was both certain and agonizing, while requiring the kind of precise control that demonstrated advanced mastery, turned toward purposes that violated every ethical principle that Air Nomad culture had traditionally embraced. Avatar Yang Chen's knowledge of similar techniques had been preserved in Air Nomad archives as warnings about the dangerous applications that airbending could encompass when practitioners abandoned the moral frameworks that traditionally governed their element's use. Her own experiments with suffocation, having been motivated by theoretical curiosity rather than practical applications, though her understanding of the technique's mechanics enabled her to develop countermeasures that protected her from similar attacks. The sound bending that represented Yang Chen's unique contribution to airbending knowledge had emerged from her research into how air could be manipulated to carry and amplify vocal energy beyond normal physiological limits. Her experiments revealing that properly directed breath could create sonic effects that transcended anything achievable through unassisted human voice, while opening possibilities for applications that she ultimately chose not to explore, due to their potential for causing permanent harm to anyone within range of her enhanced vocalizations. The incident at the beach that provided the clearest demonstration of Yang Chen's sound-bending capabilities had occurred during a period of intense emotional stress following a failed diplomatic mission that had resulted in unnecessary deaths. Her frustration finding expression in a scream that carved channels into the bedrock itself, while permanently damaging the hearing of companions who had been hundreds of yards away despite their attempts to protect themselves from the Pontius. Obviously dangerous vocalizations. The friend who lost his hearing during this demonstration provided Yang Chen with sobering evidence of her technique's potential for collateral damage, his permanent disability serving as constant reminder of how easily advanced bending abilities could cause irreversible harm to innocent people when practitioners allowed emotional instability to override the careful control that such powerful techniques demanded for safe application under any circumstances. The restraint that Yang Chen showed in never again using sound bending at full power reflected her understanding that some abilities were too dangerous to employ, regardless of their potential tactical advantages. Her commitment to protecting others from the consequences of her enhanced capabilities, taking precedence over any strategic benefits that sonic attacks might provide in combat situations, where conventional airbending proved insufficient for achieving necessary objectives. The theoretical framework that governed sound bending involved understanding how air pressure differentials could be created and maintained through precisely timed vocal emissions that resonated with natural frequencies in various materials. The technique requiring not just exceptional breath control, but intimate knowledge of acoustics and materials science that enabled practitioners to predict how their vocalizations would interact with different environmental conditions and structural elements. The applications that sound bending might theoretically encompass ranged from communication over vast distances to structural damage that could collapse buildings or shatter defensive barriers, though the precision required for such targeted effects was extraordinary, and the potential for unintended consequences made experimentation extremely dangerous for both practitioners and anyone unfortunate enough to be within range of their vocal experiments. The silence that surrounded sound-bending knowledge in Air Nomad archives reflected the tradition's collective recognition that some techniques were too dangerous to teach systematically, their potential for abuse by practitioners who lacked sufficient moral development, making it safer to let the knowledge remain hidden rather than risk its transmission to individuals who might use enhanced vocal abilities for purposes that violated the Air Nomad's fundamental commitments to peace and compassion. Spiritual projection represented airbending's most sophisticated application in terms of the relationship between consciousness and physical form. The technique enabling advanced practitioners to separate their awareness from their body temporarily, while maintaining enough connection to ensure safe return to normal embodied existence after completing whatever task had required such extreme mobility and flexibility. The practical applications of spiritual projection were numerous and varied, from reconnaissance missions that required access to heavily guarded or physically inaccessible locations, to communication with individuals who were too distant for normal interaction, though the technique's effectiveness was limited by the practitioner's spiritual development and their ability to maintain conscious control while existing in a state that was neither fully embodied nor completely discarnate. Genora's mastery of spiritual projection during her childhood represented both natural talent and intensive training under her father's guidance, her abilities, enabling her to locate missing persons and gather intelligence that conventional methods could never have provided, while demonstrating the technique's potential for serving humanitarian purposes that justified the risks inherent in consciousness body separation. The dangers associated with spiritual projection were considerable, practitioners risking permanent disconnection from their physical form if they ventured too far from their body or remained separated for extended periods, while the disorientation that accompanied return to normal embodied existence could create vulnerability to physical attack or environmental hazards that might prove fatal to someone whose consciousness was not fully integrated with their defensive capabilities and survival instincts. The training required for safe spiritual projection involved gradual expansion of the distance and duration that practitioners could maintain conscious separation from their physical form, beginning with brief moments of partial detachment and slowly building toward the kind of extended remote awareness that enabled useful applications while minimizing the risks that made the technique too dangerous for casual experimentation by anyone lacking proper preparation and supervision. Milo Anicki's developing abilities in spiritual projection reflected their Air Nomad heritage, while demonstrating how such advanced techniques could be learned through play rather than formal instruction when children were raised in environments where spiritual practices were integrated into daily life rather than treated as separate disciplines that required special preparation and ceremonial seriousness. The connection between spiritual projection and the Air Nomad's traditional emphasis on detachment and transcendence was evident in how the technique required practitioners to temporarily abandon their attachment to physical existence while maintaining enough connection to ensure they could return safely to normal embodied life when their spiritual journey was complete. The wisdom that governed the teaching of airbending's most advanced techniques reflected understanding that true mastery involved knowing when not to use abilities that were theoretically available. The tradition's emphasis on restraint and compassion serving as safeguards against the corruption that inevitably accompanied the kind of power that could reshape both physical and spiritual reality, according to individual will rather than cosmic harmony. The secrecy that surrounded these techniques was motivated not by desire to hoard knowledge, but by recognition that premature exposure to such abilities could corrupt practitioners who lacked the spiritual foundation necessary to use them responsibly. Their concealment within advanced spiritual practices, ensuring that only those who had demonstrated sufficient moral development could access power that transcended normal human limitations, while remaining grounded in ethical frameworks that prevented abuse. The legacy of airbending's secret arts extended beyond their immediate applications to encompass fundamental questions about the relationship between individual consciousness and universal forces, their existence demonstrating that the boundaries between self and cosmos were far more permeable than most people realized, while illustrating the spiritual preparation that was necessary for safely navigating such transcendent possibilities without losing touch with the human compassion that gave ultimate meaning to all forms of power and achievement. The forges that burned beneath the Fire Nation's capital had witnessed the birth of flames more varied and terrible than the rainbow spectrum itself could contain. Their ancient hearths serving as laboratories where the most ambitious firebenders had pushed their element beyond conventional orange and red into realms of heat and intensity that challenged every assumption about what combustion could to accomplish when guided by will that refused to accept the place. Limitations that bound ordinary practitioners to predictable patterns of ignition and destruction. These were the workshops where fire had been refined into art, where masters had discovered that their element possessed depths and subtleties that made the common flames of hearth and torch seem like crude approximations of forces that could remake matter itself through applications of thermal energy that transcended simple burning. The blue flames that danced from Azula's fingertips represented more than mere temperature differential. They were manifestations of spiritual intensity that had been focused through years of ruthless self-discipline and competitive drive that transformed every aspect of her firebending training into pursuit of perfection that brooked no compromise with mediocrity or acceptance of anything less than absolute mastery over forces that most practitioners approached with reverence bordering on fear. The azure fire that marked her as prodigy among prodigies burned with heat that exceeded normal flame by margins that made her attacks capable of melting metal and stone, where conventional firebending would merely scorch surface materials without penetrating to structural depths. The discovery that blue fire required fundamentally different approach to elemental manipulation had occurred during Azula's childhood training, her natural competitive instincts driving her to experiment with techniques that her instructors considered too advanced for someone her age, while her prodigious talent enabled her to survive applications that would have killed less gifted practitioners through spiritual backlash or simple thermal overload. The flames that emerged from these dangerous experiments burned with intensity that made even experienced masters step back in recognition that they were witnessing something unprecedented in their understanding of what firebending could achieve. The control mechanisms that enabled sustained blue fire production demanded psychological stability and emotional regulation that seemed paradoxical given the passionate intensity that characterized most advanced firebending. Azula's ability to maintain the kind of internal equilibrium that blue flames required while simultaneously channeling the aggressive determination that made her such formidable combatant, representing synthesis of opposites that few practitioners could achieve even through decades of dedicated practice and spiritual development. The temperature differential that distinguished blue fire from conventional flames was measurable through scientific instruments, but more importantly perceptible to anyone who encountered Azula's attacks in combat situations. Her enhanced thermal output, enabling her to cut through defensive earthbending and overwhelm waterbending cooling techniques that could normally neutralize firebending assaults through systematic heat absorption and dispersal. The strategic advantages that such superior firepower provided were evident in every major battle she participated in throughout the 100-Year War's final phases. The rarity of blue fire practitioners throughout recorded Fire Nation history suggested that the technique required not just exceptional talent, but specific personality traits and psychological conditions that were uncommon even among the most skilled firebenders. Azula's unique combination of perfectionism, competitive drive, and emotional detachment, creating internal environment where blue flames could be sustained without consuming the practitioner through spiritual or physical exhaustion, that made the technique unsuitable for extended applications. Avatar Roku's brief experimentation with blue fire during his training in the Spirit-Enhanced Cave had demonstrated that even avatars found the technique challenging to master and dangerous to maintain. His single successful application, resulting in burns to his own hands despite his cosmic connection to all elemental forces and his extensive experience with firebending's most advanced traditional techniques. The pain that accompanied his blue fire attempt served as reminder that some abilities extracted physical costs from practitioners, regardless of their spiritual development or technical proficiency. Fire Lord Sozin's occasional manifestation of blue flames during moments of extreme emotional intensity had been documented by court observers but never developed into reliable technique that he could access at will, suggesting that his blue fire episodes were stress responses rather than consciously controlled applications that demonstrated true mastery of the enhanced thermal manipulation that characterized Azula's consistent blue flame production. The strategic implications of blue fire's existence had influenced Fire Nation military planning throughout the later stages of the 100-Year War, Azula's unique capabilities being incorporated into tactical schemes that took advantage of her ability to penetrate defenses and eliminate targets that conventional firebending could not affect quickly or decisively enough to achieve strategic objectives within acceptable timeframes. The psychological impact that blue fire had on opponents often exceeded its direct physical effects. The sight of azure flames, creating fear responses that disrupted enemy coordination and decision-making, while demonstrating power levels that made resistance seem futile to combatants whose experience had not prepared them to face thermal attacks that transcended normal firebending categories. But even blue fire paled before the rainbow flames that dragons could produce through manipulation of spiritual energies that human practitioners could barely comprehend, much less replicate through conscious technique and disciplined training. The iridescent fire that Ran and Shaw had demonstrated during Aang and Zuko's trial by the original firebending masters represented the element's purest expression. Flames that contain not just heat but life force itself, creative energy that could build as easily as it could destroy, depending on the intention and wisdom of whoever wielded such transcendent thermal power. The dragon's rainbow fire burned with temperatures that exceeded even blue flames, while simultaneously carrying spiritual properties that enhanced rather than consumed whatever they touched. Their heat-serving catalytic functions that promoted growth and transformation rather than simple destruction and elimination. The experience of witnessing such flames was transformative for anyone exposed to their influence. The multicolored combustion, serving as direct demonstration of fire's true nature, as element of life and renewal, rather than death and devastation. The spiritual requirements for producing dragon fire were so demanding that only the original masters themselves had achieved consistent access to such techniques under normal circumstances. Their centuries of existence and deep connection to cosmic forces, enabling them to channel life energy through thermal manifestation in ways that remained beyond human capability, except under extraordinary conditions that provided temporary enhancement of natural abilities. Avatar Roku's single application of iridescent fire within the spirit cave had required not just his avatar connection, but additional spiritual amplification provided by the sacred location. His brief success demonstrating the technique's theoretical accessibility to human practitioners, while illustrating the exceptional circumstances that such achievement demanded from anyone lacking the dragon's innate connection to fire's deepest mysteries. The cave that had enabled both Roku and Sozin's enhanced firebending had been destroyed by the forces released during their dragonfire experiment, the structure's obliteration serving as evidence of the technique's incredible power, while suggesting that human applications of iridescent flame were inherently unstable and dangerous due to biological limitations that made sustained dragonfire production impossible for practitioners who lacked the original master's natural adaptations. The knowledge that dragons shared with Aang and Zuko during their encounter at the Sun Warrior's secret city included theoretical understanding of how rainbow flames could be achieved through perfect harmony between spiritual energy and thermal manipulation, though their instruction emphasized that such techniques were meant for observation and inspiration, rather than practical application by students whose spiritual development was insufficient to handle forces that transcended ordinary, elemental categories. Zuko's possible manifestation of iridescent fire during his family's defense against criminal attack remains subject to debate among scholars who analyze the available evidence, some arguing that his rainbow vortex represented genuine dragon fire achievement, while others maintained that artistic interpretation or unusual lighting conditions had created visual effects that resembled but did not actually constitute the authentic technique that required spiritual development far beyond his demonstrated capabilities. The question of whether Zuko had achieved true dragonfire mastery was complicated by his failure to demonstrate similar abilities during subsequent conflicts where such techniques would have provided obvious tactical advantages. His apparent loss of the ability suggesting either that his original success had been a temporary phenomenon or that conscious attempts to recreate the effect interfered with the spontaneous spiritual conditions that had made his initial achievement possible. Lightning bending represented firebending's most technically demanding and spiritually hazardous specialty. The technique requiring practitioners to separate positive and negative energies within their own body before reuniting them in controlled discharge that could be directed with lethal precision toward targets whose elimination required more certainty than conventional flames could provide. The internal energy manipulation that lightning generation demanded was so dangerous that mistakes could prove instantly fatal to practitioners whose understanding of electrical principles was insufficient to prevent uncontrolled discharge that might stop their own heart or cause brain damage through unregulated current flow. The rarity of lightning benders throughout most of Fire Nation history reflected not just the technique's difficulty, but the spiritual requirements that made safe practice possible, masters needing to achieve internal balance and emotional stability that enabled them to manipulate opposing forces without being torn apart by energies that naturally sought to neutralize each other through violent recombination that could not be safely contained within human physiology without extraordinary preparation and ongoing vigilance. The philosophical framework that made lightning bending accessible to human practitioners involved understanding electricity as expression of perfect balance rather than chaotic force. The technique requiring masters to embody the kind of internal equilibrium that could serve as stable foundation for energies that were inherently volatile and destructive when handled by anyone whose spiritual development was insufficient to maintain necessary psychological conditions throughout the generation and discharge process. Avatar Kyoshi's era had produced only one known lightning bender, the scarcity of practitioners during that period suggesting that the technique's transmission had been carefully controlled by masters who understood its dangers, while recognizing that political stability sometimes required elimination of threats that conventional methods could not address, quickly or decisively enough to prevent greater suffering among innocent populations. The increase in lightning-bending practitioners during the Hundred-Year War's later phases reflected both military necessity that motivated expanded training programs and technical innovations that made the technique more accessible to students whose natural talent was insufficient for traditional teaching methods. Fire Lord Ozai's mastery of lightning generation provided him with capabilities that few opponents could counter effectively, while Azula's precocious development of electrical techniques demonstrated how royal bloodlines might carry genetic predispositions that facilitated access to advanced firebending applications. Iroh's development of lightning redirection represented revolutionary breakthrough in defensive applications. His technique enabling practitioners to survive electrical attacks by channeling incoming energy through their body and redirecting it towards safer targets, rather than attempting to block or absorb discharges that could not be stopped through conventional defensive measures. The redirection method required understanding of energy flow patterns and careful preparation of internal pathways that could safely conduct electricity without causing permanent damage to organs or nervous systems that were not naturally designed to handle such intense electrical activity. The democratization of lightning bending during Republic City's industrial period transformed the technique from rare specialty to practical skill that could provide employment opportunities for workers whose electrical generation abilities made them valuable in power plants and factories that required reliable energy sources for manufacturing processes. The commercial applications that emerged during this era represented complete transformation of lightning, bending from military technique to civilian profession, though the safety protocols required for industrial electrical work remained demanding enough to prevent casual practitioners from entering such employment without extensive preparation and certification. The regulation of lightning generation in civilian contexts required development of new legal frameworks and safety standards that balanced individual rights with community protection needs, the technique's lethal potential, making uncontrolled practice dangerous to both practitioners and innocent bystanders who might be accidentally injured by electrical discharges from inadequately trained workers whose skills were insufficient for their professional responsibilities. The moral implications of lightning bending had evolved along with its practical applications. The technique's transition from assassination method to honest labor requiring practitioners to develop ethical frameworks that could accommodate both destructive and constructive uses of abilities that remained inherently dangerous, regardless of their intended applications. The internal balance that safe electrical generation required was as much moral as technical, practitioners needing to maintain spiritual equilibrium that prevented power from corrupting their character while enabling them to use their abilities responsibly in service of legitimate personal and social needs. The lightning that flowed from skilled practitioners' fingertips carried within its crackling energy the accumulated wisdom of generations who had learned to dance with forces that could kill or illuminate depending on the intention and character of those who channeled electrical power through flesh and bone that was never meant to conduct such intense energy without extraordinary preparation and ongoing spiritual discipline. The cold fire that lightning represented was both creation and destruction, order and chaos, demonstrating through its very existence the profound responsibilities that came with mastery over forces that could reshape both individual lives and entire civilizations through applications that transcended every conventional understanding of what fire could accomplish when guided by wisdom that refused to accept limitations imposed by fear or tradition. The sparks that danced between the fingers of lightning benders carried memories of every storm that had ever illuminated the night sky, every forge that had been lit by electrical ignition, every heart that had been stopped by misdirected current, and every innovation that had been powered by controlled electrical generation. The technique that had begun as military necessity had evolved into foundation for technological advancement that would transform civilization itself, though the practitioners who made such progress possible remained bound by ancient responsibilities to use their power wisely and with full awareness of the consequences that electrical mastery could create for everyone whose lives were touched by the lightning that flowed from human hands, trained to channel forces that belonged properly to clouds and cosmic phenomena, rather than mortal flesh that dared to claim dominion over energies that could illuminate the world, or reduce it to ash, depending on the wisdom and character of those who presumed to wield such terrible and beautiful power. The forbidden temples that crowned the most remote peaks of the Fire Nation mountains held within their crumbling walls secrets that the royal family had tried for centuries to bury beneath layers of official denial and carefully orchestrated historical revision. Their ancient chambers, containing evidence of training programs so brutal and systematically dehumanizing that even the Fire Lords who had authorized such experiments preferred to pretend they had never existed rather than acknowledge the allay depths of cruelty that pursuit of ultimate weapons had driven their predecessors to explore and implement with methodical precision. The third eye tattoos that marked combustion benders as living instruments of destruction were not decorative choices or spiritual symbols, but surgical modifications that had been developed through experimentation on unwilling subjects, whose survival was considered less important than advancing understanding of how human consciousness could be weaponized through techniques that transformed ordinary firebenders into artillery pieces, capable of producing explosions with the same reliability and devastating effect as catapults or siege engines, but with far greater mobility and tactical flexibility. The Unanimity Project that had operated during Avatar Yang Chen's era represented the Fire Nation's most ambitious attempt to create combustion benders through systematic torture and conditioning, rather than relying on the rare, natural mutations that occasionally produced individuals whose neural pathways were configured in ways that enabled mental generation of explosive energy. The training compound hidden in the volcanic wasteland of the Western Fire Nation had been designed specifically to break down psychological barriers that prevented ordinary minds from accessing the kind of focused rage and spiritual corruption that combustion techniques required as their foundational emotional state. The candidates selected for unanimity training were typically prisoners of war, political dissidents, or orphaned children, whose disappearance would not provoke investigations that might expose the project's existence to officials who lacked sufficient security clearance or moral flexibility to approve such extreme measures in service of national defense objectives. The psychological profiles that determined selection emphasized individuals whose capacity for forming emotional bonds had already been damaged by trauma or abuse, making them more likely to survive the additional psychological destruction that combustion training would inevitably inflict upon their already fragile mental states. The training regimen itself combined physical torture with spiritual manipulation, designed to forge neural pathways that could channel explosive energy without killing the practitioner immediately, though the long-term survival rate for even successful graduates was extremely low due to the biological stress that combustion bending placed upon human physiology that had not evolved to contain or direct such intense energetic discharges. The drowning exercises that formed the core of the conditioning program involved repeatedly submerging candidates in water until they approached death through oxygen deprivation, their desperate need to survive triggering neurological changes that occasionally resulted in the kind of mental rewiring that made combustion possible. The theory behind these near-death experiences was that extreme trauma could break down conventional thought patterns while creating new neural configurations that enabled consciousness to generate explosive energy through pure mental focus. The candidate's desperation to escape drowning, supposedly providing the emotional intensity necessary to access combustion abilities that remained dormant in practitioners whose lives had been too comfortable to motivate such extreme psychological adaptations. The mortality rate during training was approximately 80%, though project records suggested that many deaths were actually disguised. Executions of candidates who had developed unstable psychological conditions that made them unsuitable for military service, even if they survived the conditioning process. The survivors who successfully developed combustion abilities were often so psychologically damaged by their training that they required constant supervision and could only be deployed against targets where collateral damage was acceptable or even desired by military planners. The 3 known graduates of the Unanimity program were eventually deployed against Avatar Yangchen during her investigation of suspicious activities in the Fire Nation's Western territories. Their coordinated attacks, representing the first recorded use of multiple combustion benders in battlefield conditions. The tactical advantages that such coordinated explosive attacks provided were immediately apparent, though the psychological instability that training had created in all 3 practitioners made sustained cooperation impossible, as their damaged minds turned against each other with the same violent intensity they had been conditioned to, direct toward designated enemies. Avatar Yangchen's defeat of these artificial combustion benders required techniques that went beyond conventional combat to encompass therapeutic intervention designed to address the psychological trauma that had made their abilities possible, her approach treating them as victims of systematic abuse, rather than simply enemies to be eliminated through superior force. The healing methods she employed to counteract their conditioning demonstrated understanding of how spiritual damage could be reversed through patient application of restorative techniques, though the process was slow and not always successful due to the depth of psychological scarring that their training had created. The documentation that Yangchen discovered during her infiltration of Unanimity facilities provided evidence of the project's scope and methods that she used to pressure Fire Nation leadership into abandoning such programs. Though her diplomatic approach meant that most personnel involved escaped punishment in exchange for cooperation in dismantling the remaining infrastructure and destroying research records that could enable future replication of such PUTFA. Systematically abusive training methods. The natural combustion benders, who occasionally appeared throughout Fire Nation history, represented random genetic mutations or spiritual anomalies that enabled explosive mental energy generation without requiring the systematic, psychological destruction that artificial training programs demanded. though even these naturally gifted individuals often struggled with psychological instability and social isolation that made normal human relationships difficult or impossible to maintain. Combustion Man's pursuit of Avatar Aang demonstrated how naturally occurring combustion abilities could be focused through years of disciplined training that emphasized precision and tactical application rather than simply maximizing explosive power. His techniques showing remarkable accuracy and range that exceeded anything achieved by the Unanimity Project's artificially created practitioners. The mechanical prosthetics that replaced his missing limbs suggested previous combat experience that had tested his abilities against opponents capable of inflicting serious damage, while his methodical tracking methods indicated professional training that went beyond simple talent to encompass systematic education in assassination techniques. The weakness that ultimately led to Combustion Man's defeat was inherent in all combustion bending applications. The third eye tattoo that enabled explosive generation, also serving as vulnerable target, whose disruption could cause catastrophic backfire that killed practitioners through their own misdirected energy. The precision required to block the tattoo during active combustion generation was extraordinary, though the technique's effectiveness made such defensive measures worthwhile, despite their difficulty and the split-second timing they demanded from anyone attempting to counter combustion attacks. Poli's enhanced combustion abilities demonstrated how natural talent combined with proper training could produce capabilities that exceeded anything seen in previous practitioners. Her curved beam techniques, enabling attacks around corners and obstacles that conventional line-of-sight combustion could not affect. The psychological stability that distinguished her from most other combustion benders reflected both her natural mental resilience and the supportive relationship she maintained with Zahir, whose philosophical guidance provided emotional anchoring that prevented the isolation and psychological deterioration that affected most practitioners of such destructive techniques. The Red Lotus applications of combustion bending emphasized tactical flexibility and precision strikes rather than indiscriminate destruction. Poli's abilities being integrated into coordinated assault plans that took advantage of her range and power while minimizing exposure to countermeasures that might exploit her technique's inherent vulnerabilities. The strategic value that her abilities provided to the organization was evident in their careful protection of her welfare and the elaborate escape plans they developed to ensure her survival during high-risk operations. The relationship dynamics within the Red Lotus showed how combustion bending could be integrated into normal human connections, despite the technique's association with psychological instability and social isolation. Poli's romantic partnership with Zahir demonstrating that even practitioners of such extreme abilities could maintain emotional bonds when they found companions whose own philosophical commitments provided understanding and acceptance of the psychological costs that combustion mastery demanded. The protective measures that combustion benders required during combat reflected both their technique's power and its limitations, practitioners needing clear lines of sight and stable mental focus that made them vulnerable to disruption through environmental manipulation or psychological pressure that could interfere with the concentration that explosive generation required. The battlefield tactics that evolved around combustion bending emphasized long-range positioning and defensive support that could maintain optimal conditions for practitioners whose abilities were devastating when properly applied, but extremely dangerous to themselves when disrupted. The third eye modification that enabled combustion generation was irreversible once completed, practitioners being permanently marked with tattoos that made their abilities immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with the technique, while creating vulnerability that could never be eliminated through training or protective equipment. The surgical precision required to create functional third eyes without killing the recipient meant that even successful modifications carried ongoing health risks that shortened practitioners' life expectancy regardless of their combat survival rate. The mental discipline required for safe combustion generation involved maintaining perfect focus while channeling explosive energy that could kill the practitioner if improperly directed. The technique demanding psychological control that was difficult to achieve and maintain under stress conditions that characterized most combat applications. The meditation practices that supported combustion training emphasized emotional regulation and mental clarity that enabled practitioners to access destructive capabilities without being overwhelmed by the psychological intensity that such power naturally created. The isolation that most combustion benders experienced was both cause and effect of their abilities, their technique's association with destruction and death-making. Normal social relationships difficult, while the psychological requirements for mastering explosive generation often conflicted with the emotional connections that characterized healthy human development. The loneliness that accompanied such abilities was profound and enduring, creating psychological pressures that could destabilize practitioners whose mental health was already compromised by the training or trauma that had made their abilities possible. The legacy of combustion bending extended beyond its immediate tactical applications to encompass questions about the ethical limits of weapon development and the responsibility that societies bore for individuals whose abilities had been created through systematic abuse or whose natural gifts isolated them from normal human community. The technique represented both humanity's ingenuity in developing new forms of power and its capacity for creating suffering that served no purpose beyond demonstrating technological capability or satisfying curiosity about what might be possible when moral constraints were abandoned in favor of practical experimentation. The explosion that ended Plee's life was both liberation and tragedy, her death freeing Zahir to achieve flight while eliminating capabilities that the Red Lotus could never replace through recruitment or training of new practitioners. The irony that her destruction enabled her lover's transcendence while preventing their continued partnership illustrated the complex relationship between sacrifice and achievement that characterized all advanced bending disciplines, where ultimate mastery required practitioners to abandon everything that had made such mastery seem worthwhile in the first place. The flames that erupted from disrupted combustion attempts burned with the intensity of compressed fury and frustrated purpose, their heat carrying the accumulated anger and psychological damage that combustion training had created in practitioners whose minds had been systematically broken and rebuilt around their ability to transform thought into explosion. The technique that had been designed to create perfect weapons had instead produced individuals whose humanity had been sacrificed to capabilities that served military objectives while destroying the psychological foundations that made victory meaningful to those who achieved it through such systematic corruption of consciousness and deliberate cultivation of spiritual emptiness that made destruction seem preferable to creation. The shells that drifted through primordial oceans when the world was young and the boundary between physical and spiritual realms was as permeable as morning mist, carried upon their backs the first stirrings of consciousness that would be a lie, eventually learned to manipulate the fundamental forces of existence itself, their ancient forms, serving as mobile sanctuaries where energy could take shape and develop the capacity for deliberate intervention in cosmic processes that had previously operated according to patterns so vast and impersonal that individual will seemed meaningless against the backdrop of forces that shaped continents and guided the movement of celestial bodies across skies that had never known the touch of human ambition or spiritual yearning. The lion turtles who bore these earliest cities upon their shells were themselves bridges between worlds, beings whose existence spanned dimensions that mortal consciousness could barely comprehend, while their wisdom encompassed understanding of how energy flowed between different states of being in patterns that connected all existence, through networks of influence and interdependence that made every flesh and action ripple outward to affect outcomes that seemed completely unrelated to their original cause. Their role as humanity's first protectors reflected not dominance over lesser beings, but recognition that consciousness itself was precious beyond calculation and deserving of guidance that could help it develop safely toward its ultimate potential. The energy that these ancient guardians manipulated with such casual mastery was the fundamental substance from which all other forms of power emerged. The raw spiritual force that could be shaped into elemental bending abilities when properly focused through living consciousness that possessed sufficient development to channel such energies without being consumed or corrupted by exposure to forces that operated beyond the moral categories that governed ordinary experience. The lion turtles' understanding of this primal energy was so complete that they could grant or remove bending abilities with the same effortless precision that skilled artisans might apply paint to canvas or sculptors might shape clay into forms that expressed their deepest artistic vision. The cities that grew upon the lion turtles' shells represented humanity's first experiments with civilization under conditions of absolute safety, their inhabitants protected from the dangers of the hostile spirit wilds by the ancient wisdom and incredible power of beings whose commitment to nurturing consciousness made them willing to sacrifice their own freedom of movement in service of creatures whose potential they recognized, despite their current limitations and primitive understanding of the forces that surrounded them. These settlements became laboratories where human society could develop without the constant pressure of survival needs that might otherwise have prevented the kind of cultural and spiritual growth that the lion turtles recognized as essential for consciousness to fulfill its cosmic destiny. The bending abilities that the lion turtles granted to humans who ventured beyond the safety of their shell cities were not permanent gifts, but temporary enhancements that enabled survival in environments where natural human capabilities would have proven inadequate against the spiritual entities and elemental forces that dominated the world beyond civilized boundaries. The technique of granting these abilities involved direct manipulation of the recipient's life energy, the lion turtle's consciousness reaching into the spiritual core of the human volunteer to create pathways that could channel elemental power through biological systems that had not evolved to handle such energy safely or effectively. The selection process for humans who would receive bending abilities was based on spiritual development rather than physical capability or social status. The lion turtle's ancient wisdom enabling them to perceive which individuals possessed the moral foundation necessary to wield elemental power without being corrupted by its influence or overwhelmed by temptations that such abilities inevitably created. The training that accompanied the granting of bending powers emphasized responsibility and restraint rather than raw effectiveness, the ancient guardians understanding that conscious beings with the power to reshape their environment needed ethical frameworks that could guide their decisions when immediate self-interest conflicted with broader considerations of justice and cosmic harmony. The Avatar's emergence as a being capable of mastering all four elements simultaneously represented evolution beyond the lion turtle's original system, one's fusion with Rava creating precedent for permanent bending abilities that could be passed from one incarnation to the next through spiritual mechanisms that operated independently of the ancient guardian's direct intervention. This development marked the beginning of humanity's transition towards spiritual independence. Though the avatar cycle itself remained dependent on understanding and techniques that the lion turtles had originally developed through their eons of experience with energy manipulation and consciousness development. The withdrawal of the lion turtles from active involvement in human affairs following the avatar's establishment reflected their recognition that continued dependence on external protection would prevent humanity from developing the spiritual maturity necessary for managing elemental abilities responsibly without supervision that created more problems than it solved. The ancient guardians' decision to retreat to hidden locations where they could continue existing without interfering in human development demonstrated wisdom that balanced their protective instincts with understanding that growth required independence even when such freedom created opportunities for mistakes that protective intervention might have prevented. The knowledge of energy bending that the lion turtles preserved during their withdrawal represented the most advanced understanding of consciousness manipulation that had ever been developed. Techniques that could reach directly into the spiritual core of living beings to grant, modify, or remove abilities that seemed fundamental to their nature and identity. The preservation of this knowledge through oral tradition and spiritual practice ensured that such techniques would remain available for future emergencies when conventional approaches to conflict resolution proved inadequate for Krupless, addressing threats that endangered the basic foundations of civilized existence. The last lion turtle's emergence from centuries of hiding to assist Avatar Aang represented desperate intervention at a moment when the Avatar cycle itself was threatened by Fire Lord Ozai's plan to use Sozin's comet for genocidal destruction that would have eliminated entire populations while creating spiritual damage that might have prevented future avatars from maintaining the balance between worlds that the lion turtles had originally established as their primary responsibility. The ancient guardian's decision to break his long isolation demonstrated that some crises required direct intervention regardless of the philosophical costs that such involvement might create for humanity's ongoing spiritual development. The instruction in energy bending that the lion turtle provided to Aang was condensed into a single session that attempted to convey understanding that had been developed over geological ages. The compressed nature of this education, requiring the avatar to absorb through direct spiritual transmission knowledge that would normally have taken decades of careful study and practice to master safely. The technique itself required not just intellectual understanding, but absolute moral certainty and spiritual purity that could prevent corruption by the very energies being manipulated, practitioners needing to maintain psychological stability while working with forces that could transform both bender and target in ways that might prove irreversible. The energy bending that Aang applied to remove Fire Lord Ozai's bending abilities was performed under conditions of extreme stress that made the technique's inherent dangers even more pronounced. His need to act quickly while maintaining perfect spiritual focus, requiring reserves of inner strength that had been developed through years of avatar training and spiritual discipline that provided barely adequate foundation for handling energies that even experienced lion turtles approached with appropriate caution and reverence. The success of this application demonstrated both Aang's spiritual development and the desperate circumstances that made such risks acceptable when conventional alternatives had been exhausted. The spiritual battle that accompanied the energy bending process involved direct confrontation between Aang's moral certainty and Ozai's accumulated corruption, their consciousness wrestling for dominance in realms where victory or defeat would determine not just the immediate outcome, but the fundamental nature of whoever emerged from such intimate spiritual combat. The Fire Lord's resistance to having his abilities removed reflected not just attachment to power, but genuine fear of becoming ordinary human being, without the elemental mastery that had defined his identity and enabled his sense of superiority over everyone he had dominated throughout his career as absolute ruler. The precision required for successful energy bending demanded that practitioners understand exactly which aspects of their target's spiritual structure to modify, while leaving other elements untouched. The technique's complexity, making it far more difficult than simple destruction of the entire life force would have been, while serving purposes that crude elimination could never achieve. The ability to remove bending without killing required mapping consciousness patterns that were unique to each individual, while developing sufficient sensitivity to distinguish between essential identity markers and acquired abilities that could be severed without causing fundamental damage to personality or memory. Avatar Korra's discovery that energy-bending knowledge had practical applications beyond removing criminal benders' abilities expanded understanding of the technique's potential, while demonstrating how spiritual development could enable innovative approaches to problems that conventional bending had proven inadequate to address effectively. Her use of energy bending to restore abilities that Amon had severed through blood bending provided evidence that the technique could be applied therapeutically as well as punitively, healing spiritual damage that other methods could never repair, while offering hope to victims whose losses had seemed permanent and irreversible. The astral projection capabilities that energy bending enabled represented extension of consciousness beyond physical boundaries that normal human experience could barely comprehend. Practitioners developing ability to exist temporarily as pure spiritual energy, while maintaining enough connection to their physical form to ensure safe return to normal embodied existence. Korra's mastery of this application demonstrated how energy bending could transcend its original functions to encompass exploration of spiritual realms that were normally accessible only to beings whose existence was naturally discarnator. The giant spirit projection that Korra manifested during her confrontation with Kuvira's spirit cannon represented energy bending's ultimate expression as tool for defending spiritual values against technological threats that sought to weaponize the very forces that made life meaningful and beautiful. The technique required her to channel not just her personal energy but spiritual power from sources throughout Republic City, creating temporary fusion between human consciousness and cosmic forces that enabled intervention on scales that individual bending could never achieve, regardless of practitioner skill or dedication. The risks associated with such massive energy bending applications were enormous. Practitioners potentially losing their individual identity through merger with spiritual forces that operated according to principles and purposes that transcended personal concerns and human-scale motivations. Korra's successful navigation of these dangers reflected both her spiritual development and her strong connections to friends and family who provided anchoring influences that prevented complete dissolution into cosmic consciousness, that might have eliminated her capacity for human emotion and individual decision-making. The spirit vine energy that provided raw material for Kuvira's cannon represented perverted application of energy-bending principles. The technology's creators having discovered methods for extracting and concentrating spiritual power without understanding or caring about the spiritual damage that such processes inflicted upon the sources from which energy was harvested. The weapon's destructive potential demonstrated how energy-bending knowledge could be corrupted when acquired by individuals whose moral development was insufficient for handling techniques that required absolute commitment to preserving rather than exploiting the life force that connected all existence. Korra's ability to redirect the spirit cannon's energy through pure energy bending represented triumph of spiritual understanding over technological sophistication, her mastery of fundamental principles enabling her to neutralize weapons that had been created through misapplication of the same knowledge that she was using to protect innocent people from destruction that would have served no purpose. Beyond demonstrating power that had been divorced from wisdom or compassion, the portal that opened as a result of the spirit cannon's energies being properly redirected created new connection between physical and spirit worlds that would influence subsequent avatar duties, while demonstrating how crisis situations could sometimes produce beneficial outcomes when handled by practitioners whose spiritual development enabled them to transform destructive forces into opportunities for growth and positive change. The bridge between worlds that emerged from this confrontation represented evolution in the relationship between human and spiritual realms that the lion turtles themselves might not have anticipated when they first began teaching humans to manipulate elemental energy. The teaching of energy bending to future generations would require development of educational systems that could provide both technical instruction and spiritual preparation, adequate for handling abilities that remain dangerous even in the hands of well-intentioned practitioners whose moral development was insufficient for the responsibilities that such knowledge inevitably created. The screening processes necessary to identify suitable students would need to be more rigorous than anything previously developed for conventional bending instruction. The technique's potential for both healing and destruction, making careful candidate selection essential for preventing abuse or tragic accidents. The preservation of energy bending knowledge for future avatars represented ongoing responsibility that connected each incarnation to the original lion turtle wisdom, while requiring adaptation to changing circumstances and evolving understanding of how consciousness could be developed and applied to serve both individual growth and cosmic harmony. The techniques that had been preserved from the world's earliest spiritual traditions would need to continue evolving to address challenges that ancient practitioners could never have imagined, while maintaining essential principles that connected all genuine spiritual development to service of purposes larger than personal ambition or immediate practical necessity. The energy that flowed through successful energy bending applications carried within its currents the accumulated wisdom of every consciousness that had contributed to its development. From the first lion turtles who had discovered how to shape spiritual force into elemental abilities, to the most recent practitioners who had learned to restore what had been damaged and protect what remained precious in a world where technological advancement sometimes threatened to destroy the very sources of meaning that made progress worthwhile. The bridge between worlds that energy bending represented was both technique and philosophy, method and purpose, demonstrating through its very existence the eternal possibility for consciousness to transcend its limitations while serving ends that honored the cosmic processes from which all individual existence emerged, and to which it would eventually return, enriched by whatever wisdom experience had provided during its brief journey through forms that made learning and service and love possible, despite the inevitable challenges that accompanied any serious attempt to use power responsibly in service of justice and beauty and truth. The archives that lay buried beneath the deepest foundations of Ba Sing Se contained scrolls written in scripts that predated the formation of the four nations themselves. Their yellowed pages preserving accounts of bending techniques so extraordinary that modern scholars dismissed them as mythological embellishments rather than historical records of abilities that had once been mastered by practitioners whose understanding of elemental manipulation transcended every boundary that contemporary bending theory considered absolute and immutable. These forgotten texts spoke of earthbenders who could reshape continents with single gestures, waterbenders who commanded the very essence of life and death, firebenders whose flames could burn through the barriers between physical and spirit worlds, and airbenders whose mastery had enabled them to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions, while maintaining perfect awareness of cosmic forces that governed reality's deepest structures. The theoretical combinations that these ancient documents described challenged every assumption about elemental boundaries and the limitations that prevented ordinary benders from accessing abilities that seemed to belong to other domains entirely. Their accounts suggesting that the separation between earth, water, fire, and air was artificial construct rather than fundamental law of nature. The text spoke of masters who had achieved synthesis between opposing elements through spiritual development so profound that their consciousness could perceive underlying unity that connected all manifestations of energy regardless of the specific forms through which they chose to express themselves in physical reality. The time manipulation techniques that several fragmentary scrolls attributed to certain airbenders represented perhaps the most impossible of all lost arts, their descriptions suggesting that masters who achieved sufficient detachment from material existence could alter the flow of temporal experience around themselves and others, while maintaining normal consciousness and decision-making capabilities. The theoretical framework that would make such abilities possible required understanding time not as linear progression, but as dimensional space, that consciousness could navigate through appropriate spiritual preparation combined with airbending techniques that manipulated atmospheric pressure in ways that affected local gravitational fields and their influence on temporal flow patterns. The space-folding applications that earthbending masters had reportedly achieved during the earliest periods of recorded history involved manipulation of geological forces that could compress vast distances into manageable spans, enabling practitioners to step from one location to another, separated by hundreds of miles, through techniques that operated by temporarily altering the fundamental structure of reality itself, rather than simply moving through existing spatial arrangements. The spiritual requirements for such abilities were described as absolute and permanent, practitioners needing to abandon every attachment to specific location or physical form that might interfere with their capacity to exist fluidly within dimensions that normal consciousness could not perceive or navigate. The life creation techniques that ancient waterbending masters had supposedly developed represented the ultimate expression of their element's connection to biological processes, their abilities extending beyond healing and preservation to encompass actual generation of living beings from raw spiritual energy combined with appropriate organic materials. The ethical implications of such capabilities were staggering in their scope: the power to create conscious life, carrying responsibilities that even avatar-level spiritual development might prove inadequate to handle without corruption or catastrophic error that could affect not just individual practitioners, but entire ecosystems and evolutionary processes that had been developing over geological time periods. The soul fusion applications that the most advanced firebenders had allegedly mastered involved temporary merger of consciousness between multiple individuals, their combined spiritual energy enabling collective bending that far exceeded anything possible through individual effort, while creating shared awareness that encompassed multiple perspectives and skill sets simultaneously. The risks associated with such techniques were enormous. Participants potentially losing their individual identity through incomplete separation after fusion sessions, while gaining access to memories and abilities that belonged to other people whose privacy and autonomy were violated through such intimate spiritual connection. The dimensional shifting that certain avatar-level practitioners had supposedly achieved represented the ultimate expression of energy bending applications, their mastery enabling them to exist partially in spirit world while maintaining physical form and normal human relationships in material realm. The descriptions of such abilities suggested that successful practitioners could perceive and interact with spiritual entities while simultaneously handling ordinary avatar responsibilities. Their enhanced awareness, providing access to guidance and resources that purely physical existence could never supply, but requiring psychological stability that few individuals possessed, even after decades of intensive spiritual training. The emotional manipulation techniques that some water-bending masters had developed represented dark applications of healing knowledge that could alter personality patterns and psychological responses through systematic manipulation of neurochemical processes that govern mood, memory, and decision-making capabilities. The theoretical framework that made such abilities possible involved understanding consciousness not as unified whole, but as collection of processes that could be individually modified through techniques that treated psychological patterns as extensions of the biological systems that supported brain function and neural activity. The memory extraction applications that earth-bending specialists had allegedly perfected enabled practitioners to remove specific experiences from their target's consciousness while leaving other aspects of memory and personality intact. The technique requiring extraordinary precision and intimate knowledge of how geological forces could influence electromagnetic patterns in brain tissue. The strategic advantages that such abilities would provide were obvious, though their existence remained entirely theoretical, due to lack of living practitioners who could demonstrate or teach methods that might have been lost when their original masters died, without passing on knowledge that was considered too dangerous for widespread transmission. The weather control techniques that some airbending masters had supposedly achieved went far beyond conventional atmospheric manipulation to encompass systematic alteration of climate patterns across vast geographical regions, their abilities enabling them to prevent droughts, redirect storms, and modify seasonal patterns through applications that operated on scales previously considered possible only through collective action by multiple benders working in perfect coordination. The spiritual requirements for such massive environmental intervention were described as absolute surrender of personal desires and individual identity, practitioners becoming instruments of cosmic will, rather than independent agents with private motivations and concerns. The plant manipulation applications that earthbending masters had allegedly developed represented synthesis between their traditional domain and the biological processes that waterbending normally influenced, their techniques enabling them to accelerate growth, modify genetic characteristics, and create entirely new species through manipulation of mineral nutrients and cellular structures that bridged the gap between geological and biological systems. The agricultural implications of such abilities were staggering, though their potential for ecological disruption made them unsuitable for casual application even by practitioners whose intentions were entirely benevolent. The spirit summoning techniques that firebenders had reportedly mastered during certain historical periods involved using their element's connection to spiritual energy to call forth discarnate entities and bind them to temporary service in physical realm, the practitioners serving as living bridges through which spiritual consciousness could manifest material effects. The moral complexities inherent in such applications were enormous, the consent and welfare of summoned spirits requiring consideration that few human practitioners possessed sufficient wisdom to provide, while the potential for abuse made the techniques unsuitable for anyone whose spiritual development was incomplete. The probability manipulation abilities that some avatar-level practitioners had allegedly achieved represented the ultimate expression of cosmic consciousness applied to practical problem solving. Their awareness of multiple potential outcomes, enabling them to influence which possibilities would manifest in physical reality through subtle applications of spiritual energy that affected quantum-level processes. The philosophical implications of such capabilities challenged fundamental assumptions about free will and causation, their existence suggesting that individual consciousness could participate directly in shaping reality, rather than simply responding to circumstances that existed independently of awareness and intention. The dream-walking techniques that airbending masters had supposedly developed enabled practitioners to enter and influence the sleeping consciousness of others, their applications ranging from therapeutic intervention in psychological trauma to intelligence gathering that could access memories and knowledge that targets would never consciously reveal. The invasion of privacy that such abilities represented was absolute, though their potential for healing severe mental damage made them theoretically valuable for addressing conditions that conventional treatment could never remedy through purely external intervention. The time-viewing applications that certain earthbending masters had allegedly achieved involved manipulation of mineral crystals that could store electromagnetic impressions of past events, their techniques enabling them to perceive historical occurrences with accuracy that surpassed any written record or oral tradition. The strategic value of such abilities for understanding political situations and resolving disputes was enormous, though the spiritual requirements for safe practice were described as demanding complete emotional detachment from outcomes that knowledge might reveal, practitioners needing to serve as neutral observers rather than advocates for any particular interpretation of events they witnessed. The death prevention techniques that waterbending masters had supposedly perfected went beyond conventional healing to encompass actual reversal of biological death through manipulation of cellular processes and spiritual energy patterns that normally ceased functioning when consciousness separated from physical form. The ethical implications of such abilities were staggering, their application requiring decisions about which deaths were appropriate to prevent, while considering consequences that might extend across multiple lifetimes and affect karmic patterns that govern spiritual development through successive incarnations. The elemental fusion applications that avatar-level practitioners had allegedly achieved represented synthesis of all four elements into entirely new forms of matter and energy that possessed characteristics impossible to achieve through any single bending discipline, their techniques creating substances that could simultaneously exhibit properties of earth, water, fire, and air, while remaining stable enough for practical applications. The theoretical framework that would make such combinations possible required understanding elements not as separate forces but as different expressions of unified cosmic energy that could be recombined through appropriate spiritual preparation and technical mastery. The consciousness transfer techniques that energy-bending masters had supposedly developed enabled practitioners to move their awareness between different bodies while maintaining continuity of memory and personality, their applications potentially offering immortality through successive incarnations in willing hosts whose own consciousness would be temporarily displaced or permanently absorbed. The spiritual implications of such abilities challenged every assumption about individual identity and the boundaries that separated one person from another, their existence suggesting that consciousness might be far more fluid and transferable than normal experience indicated. The reality restructuring applications that the most advanced practitioners had allegedly mastered represented the ultimate expression of bending knowledge applied to fundamental forces that governed existence itself, their techniques enabling systematic alteration of physical laws and cosmic principles through manipulation of spiritual energy patterns that operated at levels far beyond normal elemental applications. The descriptions of such abilities suggested that successful masters could temporarily transform local reality according to their conscious intention, creating pockets of space where normal rules were suspended and replaced by whatever principles the practitioner considered more appropriate for achieving specific objectives. The theoretical understanding that connected all these lost arts involved recognition that bending was not manipulation of external elements, but expression of consciousness, interacting with different aspects of cosmic energy that appeared separate only due to limitations in perception and spiritual development. The practitioners who had achieved such extraordinary abilities had supposedly transcended conventional boundaries between self and world, their consciousness expanding to encompass direct awareness of underlying unity that connected all manifestations of energy, regardless of the specific forms through which they chose to express themselves in material reality. The reasons why such extraordinary techniques had been lost to modern practitioners involved combination of spiritual decline, political upheaval, and deliberate concealment by masters who recognized that premature exposure to ultimate bending applications could corrupt individuals whose character was insufficient for handling abilities that approached cosmic power. The selection criteria that had governed transmission of such knowledge were apparently so stringent that most techniques died with their creators rather than being passed on to students whose spiritual development might have been adequate for learning but insufficient for teaching such dangerous arts to future generations. The modern attempts to recreate lost bending abilities faced obstacles that went beyond simple lack of technical knowledge to encompass fundamental changes in human consciousness and spiritual development that made the kind of transcendent awareness that ultimate techniques required increasingly rare among practitioners whose education had been shaped by contemporary values and social conditions. The individualistic focus that characterized modern society was apparently incompatible with the complete selflessness that advanced bending applications demanded from masters who needed to serve cosmic purposes rather than personal objectives. The oral traditions that preserved fragmentary knowledge of lost arts often contained warnings about the spiritual costs that ultimate bending abilities imposed upon practitioners who achieved them successfully. Their accounts suggesting that mastery of reality-altering techniques required abandonment of everything that made ordinary human existence meaningful and pleasant. The loneliness and alienation that accompanied such transcendence were described as absolute and irreversible, masters becoming isolated from normal human community through consciousness that no longer shared common frames of reference or emotional responses with people whose spiritual development remained within conventional boundaries. The theoretical possibilities that remained unexplored within conventional bending suggested that even modern practitioners might be capable of achieving abilities that seemed impossible, according to current understanding, their potential limited more by philosophical assumptions and cultural expectations than by fundamental restrictions on what consciousness could accomplish through proper preparation and spiritual development. The future evolution of bending would likely depend upon rediscovering approaches to training and education that emphasize spiritual growth rather than technical proficiency alone, creating conditions where extraordinary abilities could develop safely within practitioners whose character was adequate for handling powers that transcended normal human limitations, while serving purposes worthy of such cosmic gifts. The meditation chambers carved into the highest peaks of the Eastern Air Temple had witnessed more ethical debates than battles, their stone walls absorbing centuries of philosophical discourse about the relationship between power and responsibility that lay at the heart of every advanced bending discipline. The ancient masters who had shaped these spaces, understanding that technical mastery without moral foundation was not achievement, but catastrophe, waiting to manifest through practitioners whose abilities exceeded their wisdom by margins that made their success indistinguishable from their ultimate corruption and spiritual destruction. The weight that settled upon the shoulders of every bender who progressed beyond conventional techniques was not physical burden, but spiritual pressure that came from recognizing how easily abilities designed to serve life could be perverted into instruments of domination and control. Their enhanced capabilities, creating temptations that grew stronger with each new level of mastery, while the moral frameworks necessary to resist such corrupting influences remained as fragile and requiring of constant attention as they had been during the earliest stages of elemental education, when power was too limited to cause truly devastating harm. The spiritual cost that accompanied forbidden techniques was not punishment imposed by external authority, but natural consequence of violating principles that governed the relationship between consciousness and cosmic energy. Practitioners who used their abilities for purposes that conflicted with their element's essential nature, inevitably experiencing internal discord that manifested as psychological instability, physical illness, and progressive isolation from the sources of meaning and connection that made existence worth preserving, rather than simply enduring until death provided escape from suffering that had become unbearable. Bloodbending's corruption of waterbending's healing nature created psychological wounds in practitioners that conventional therapy could never address adequately, the technique's applications requiring systematic dehumanization of targets that gradually extended to encompass the bloodbender's perception of all human relationships as potential opportunities for manipulation and control, rather than sources of mutual support and emotional nourishment that consciousness required for healthy development and continued spiritual growth throughout lifetimes that were meant to be journeys toward greater wisdom and compassion. The isolation that bloodbending mastery inevitably produced was both practical necessity and spiritual consequence, practitioners needing to hide their abilities while simultaneously losing capacity for normal emotional connections due to the psychological adaptations that made such intimate violations of autonomy possible in the first place. The loneliness that resulted was profound and enduring, creating internal emptiness that no amount of power could fill, because the exercise of such abilities required abandonment of the very qualities that made companionship and love achievable for people whose hearts remained open to experiences that transcended individual desire and self-interest. Heart-freezing represented the ultimate perversion of healing knowledge into instrument of execution. Avatar Kyoshi's mastery of this technique, requiring psychological compartmentalization that enabled her to maintain both life-preserving and life-ending applications of the same fundamental understanding while paying spiritual costs that influenced her approach to relationships and governance throughout her extraordinarily long life. The technique's existence served as permanent reminder of how thin the line between healing and harming could become when practitioners allowed practical necessity to override moral constraints that had been established not arbitrarily, but through hard experience of what happened when power was exercised without appropriate spiritual preparation. The earthbending philosophy that emphasized standing firm and meeting challenges directly could be corrupted into rigid thinking that justified violence and domination when practitioners lost sight of their element's deeper nature as foundation for growth rather than obstacle to progress. The same steadiness that enabled proper earthbending becoming source of spiritual stagnation when applied to situations that required flexibility and willingness to adapt approaches that were no longer serving beneficial purposes in changed circumstances. Metalbending's revolutionary expansion of earthbending capabilities created new possibilities for both service and oppression. The technique's applications in law enforcement and construction, demonstrating how advanced abilities could serve community welfare, while their potential for creating restraints and barriers that could not be broken by conventional means illustrated how easily such innovations could become tools of tyranny when wielded by authorities whose moral development was insufficient for the responsibilities that enhanced power inevitably created. Lavabending's destructive potential made it particularly susceptible to corruption by practitioners whose psychological balance was disturbed by trauma, anger, or philosophical commitments that justified causing massive damage to achieve political objectives. The technique's capability for reshaping entire landscapes, making it unsuitable for use by anyone whose spiritual development had not reached levels that could ensure restraint and wisdom in applications that could affect thousands of innocent people through environmental changes that might prove irreversible. The airbending principle that emphasized freedom and detachment could be twisted into justification for abandoning moral responsibilities and social obligations when practitioners misunderstood liberation as license rather than discipline, their pursuit of spiritual transcendence, becoming excuse for causing harm to others whose needs and rights were dismissed as earthly attachments that enlightened individuals should ignore in favor of serving abstractions that had no genuine connection to the compassion that made spiritual development meaningful rather than merely self-indulgent. Flight's achievement through complete detachment from earthly concerns represented both ultimate spiritual accomplishment and warning about the costs that transcendence could exact from practitioners who achieved liberation at the expense of their capacity for human connection and service to others whose welfare depended upon people with advanced abilities, choosing to remain engaged with ordinary concerns rather than retreating into isolation that served personal spiritual development while abandoning responsibilities that community membership inevitably created. Suffocation techniques demonstrated how airbending could be corrupted into instruments of murder that violated every principle the air nomads had developed about respecting all forms of life. The applications that Zahir developed, representing systematic perversion of traditional teachings into justifications for assassination and terrorism that served political ideology rather than spiritual wisdom or genuine concern for reducing suffering in the world. Firebending's association with passion and drive could be corrupted into destructive rage and uncontrolled aggression when practitioners allowed emotional intensity to override rational consideration and moral constraint. The same inner fire that enabled healing and creation, becoming source of devastation when directed by consciousness that had lost touch with purposes larger than immediate personal desires or ideological commitments that justified causing pain to achieve objectives that might seem noble in abstract consideration but proved harmful in practical application. Lightning Generation's requirement for perfect internal balance made it particularly dangerous for practitioners whose psychological development was incomplete. The technique's applications as both precise tool and devastating weapon, creating temptations for misuse that could corrupt even well-intentioned individuals whose understanding of responsibility was insufficient for the power that electrical mastery provided over life and death decisions that affected not just immediate targets, but entire communities whose stability depended upon restraint and wisdom from those whose abilities transcended normal human limitations. Blue Fire's intensity made it attractive to practitioners whose competitive instincts and perfectionist tendencies could override moral considerations, when pursuit of technical mastery became more important than spiritual development. The enhanced capabilities that such flames provided potentially corrupting benders who confused superior destructive capacity with genuine achievement and allowed pride in their abilities to replace concern for how such power should be used in service of purposes worthy of the gifts they had received. Combustion bending's development through systematic torture and psychological destruction demonstrated how advanced abilities could be created through methods that violated every principle of healthy spiritual development. The techniques that emerged from such training carrying spiritual contamination that made practitioners inherently unstable and dangerous, regardless of their conscious intentions or attempts to use their abilities for constructive purposes. The dragonfire that represented firebending's highest expression was accessible only to practitioners whose spiritual development had reached levels that made corruption essentially impossible. The technique's life-enhancing properties, serving as natural safeguard against misuse, while demonstrating how ultimate mastery involved transcendence of the ego-driven motivations that made lesser applications susceptible to perversion through selfish or ideologically motivated applications. Energy bending represented the most dangerous of all advanced techniques, precisely because its applications could be used for both ultimate good and ultimate evil, depending entirely upon the spiritual development and moral character of the Phosens. Praktitioner, the ability to directly manipulate life force and consciousness, requiring levels of wisdom and compassion that were extremely rare even among avatar-level spiritual masters whose cosmic responsibilities provided them with enhanced awareness of the consequences that their actions could create across multiple lifetimes and dimensions. The Avatar's unique position regarding forbidden techniques created moral complexities that no previous incarnation had fully resolved. Their access to abilities that could reshape reality, requiring decisions about which techniques were appropriate to use, under what circumstances, while maintaining spiritual balance that prevented power from corrupting their essential nature as bridges between worlds, whose service needed to remain motivated by love rather than duty or abstract principle alone. The spiritual masters, whose wisdom had been preserved through oral tradition, consistently emphasized that the most advanced techniques were also the most dangerous, not because they were technically difficult to master, but because they created opportunities for spiritual corruption that were proportional to their power and scope of influence. The screening methods that these masters had developed for identifying suitable students involved prolonged observation of character under stress conditions that revealed whether candidates possessed the moral foundation necessary for handling abilities that could affect thousands of people through single applications. The temptation that accompanied ultimate power was not simply desire to use abilities for selfish purposes, but more subtle corruption that involved using techniques for apparently noble ends, while gradually losing sight of the spiritual qualities that made such power worth having in the first place. The practitioners who fell to this form of corruption often began with genuine dedication to service, but slowly became focused on results rather than means, their pursuit of effective solutions leading them to abandon moral constraints that seemed to interfere with achieving outcomes they considered necessary for protecting or helping others. The isolation that advanced practitioners often experienced was both consequence of their abilities and contributing factor to their potential corruption. The responsibilities and dangers associated with forbidden techniques, making normal relationships difficult to maintain, while the secrecy necessary to prevent misuse of such knowledge created barriers to emotional support and moral guidance that healthy human development required even for individuals whose spiritual advancement exceeded ordinary levels. The philosophical frameworks that had been developed to guide advanced practitioners emphasized that true mastery involved knowing when not to use abilities that were theoretically available, the ultimate expression of power being restraint exercised in service of purposes that transcended immediate practical considerations to encompass long-term consequences for spiritual development and cosmic harmony that might be invisible to consciousness, that was focused primarily on solving immediate problems through available technical means. The cultural approaches that different nations had developed for managing dangerous bending abilities reflected their values and understanding of the relationship between individual capability and social responsibility. The air nomads' emphasis on spiritual development, contrasting with the Fire Nation's focus on practical applications, while the Earth Kingdom's approach stressed stability and the Water Tribes emphasized balance and adaptation to changing circumstances that required flexible responses, rather than rigid adherence to predetermined principles. The balance between preserving valuable knowledge and preventing its misuse had never been satisfactorily resolved by any tradition or institution. The techniques that could serve ultimate good, also carrying potential for ultimate harm, that made their transmission inherently dangerous, regardless of the precautions and screening methods that teachers attempted to implement. The oral traditions that had preserved such knowledge often included more warnings about dangers than instructions for safe practice, their emphasis on spiritual preparation, reflecting hard experience of what happened when technical knowledge was transmitted to practitioners whose character was insufficient for their enhanced capabilities. The eternal struggle between capability and morality that characterized all advanced bending disciplines reflected broader questions about consciousness and cosmic purpose that every practitioner ultimately faced, regardless of their specific elemental affiliation or level of technical mastery. Their individual choices about how to use whatever abilities they possessed, contributing to collective patterns of spiritual development that influenced conditions for future generations whose opportunities for growth would be shaped by decisions that current practitioners made about serving purposes larger than immediate self-interest. The responsibility that came with knowledge of forbidden techniques was not burden imposed from outside, but natural consequence of understanding how individual actions influenced cosmic patterns of cause and effect that connected all existence through networks of mutual dependence and shared destiny. The advanced practitioner's awareness of such connections, making ethical behavior not optional choice, but inevitable expression of wisdom that recognized how personal, spiritual development and universal welfare were ultimately identical rather than competing priorities that required difficult choices between self and others. And so we reach the end of our journey through the hidden depths of bending mastery, having walked together through shadows where ancient secrets whisper of powers that shaped the very foundations of civilization itself. We have witnessed the terrible beauty of techniques that could heal or destroy with equal precision, abilities that demanded not just skill, but spiritual wisdom that few practitioners ever achieved completely. From Hama's desperate discovery in Fire Nation captivity to the dragon fire that danced with rainbow light, from the lion turtle's primordial energy bending to techniques so dangerous they died with their creators, each forbidden art carried within it the eternal question that haunts all who seek ultimate power, whether consciousness elevated by extraordinary ability remains grounded in the compassion that makes such gifts meaningful rather than merely impressive. The masters who developed these techniques understood that true strength lay not in the capacity to bend reality to one's will, but in the wisdom to know when such power should remain unused. Their greatest achievements, often involving restraint, rather than demonstration. As you drift toward peaceful slumber, carry with you the understanding that every ability, no matter how advanced, serves purposes larger than individual ambition, and that the most profound mastery involves choosing love over fear, preservation over destruction, service over domination. In recognition that we are all connected through forces more subtle than any bending discipline could ever hope to command or contain.